The archive room smelled the way very old places smell, of paper slowly returning to dust, of leather bindings cracked by centuries, of air that hadn't moved properly since before anyone living was born. Afternoon light came through windows so thick with grime it arrived amber and soft, casting long shadows across rows of wooden shelves that stretched toward a ceiling lost in dimness. This was the kind of place universities forget they own, where documents go not to be preserved, but to be quietly ignored until someone, someday, decides they might matter again. Dr. Elena Volkov wasn't supposed to be there. She was a junior historian, 3 years into a position that paid poorly and promised little, assigned the task no one else wanted: inventory work. Cataloguing boxes that hadn't been opened since they were shelved in the late 1700s. It was punishment disguised as responsibility, the academic equivalent of exile. She didn't complain. Exile, she'd learned, sometimes offered solitude that offices full of departmental politics never could. The box sat on a shelf at chest height, wedged between 2 larger crates labelled in faded ink she couldn't quite read. It was wooden, not particularly ornate, but deliberately crafted dovetail joints, a fitted lid, brass hinges that had turned green with age. What caught her attention wasn't beauty, but intent. Someone had made this box to last, but also to blend in. It wore no markings, no dramatic seals, nothing that would draw the eye of a curious archivist flipping through catalogues in 1790 or 1820 or 1900. It wanted to be overlooked. She pulled it down carefully, feeling the weight of it heavier than it looked. Dust rose in a small cloud, dancing in that amber light. The wood was smooth under her fingers, polished by hands long dead. And there, on the lid's edge, nearly invisible unless you knew to look, a wax seal, cracked but intact, pressed with 2 crests intertwined in a way that made her pause. She didn't recognize either symbol, not immediately, but something about the pairing felt wrong, like seeing 2 animals that shouldn't coexist printed on the same coin. The lid resisted at first. Then it gave with a sound like an exhale, wood against wood, a breath held for 2 centuries finally released. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture at bay longer than it had any right to, lay a single document. Parchment, folded once, tied with ribbon that had been blue, but was now the colour of old bone. Elena untied it slowly. Her hands were steady. She'd handled fragile documents before. But as she unfolded the parchment and saw the script formal, flowing, written in the diplomatic language of the 17th century, her breath caught not from awe but from confusion. The signatures at the bottom belonged to kingdoms she knew, Valdoria and Mortemarch. She'd studied them both in graduate school, written papers on their conflicts, their trade routes, their eventual collapse into larger empires. They were enemies, bitter, generational, absolute enemies. The 30 years border war had defined both nations, had killed tens of thousands, had reshaped the political landscape of an entire region. And yet here, in her hands, was a treaty between them. Dated, signed, sealed, May 3rd, 1672. She looked up at the empty archive, at the dust still settling in the amber light. Her mind was already racing through dates, through timelines memorized from textbooks, from primary sources, from lectures she'd given to undergraduates who barely paid attention. May 3rd, 1672. She knew that date, knew it well. On that day, according to every historical record in existence, both kingdoms were at war, not negotiating, not corresponding, burning each other's fields, raiding each other's villages. So what she held in her hands shouldn't exist. The parchment felt real. That was the first thing Elena confirmed, running her fingertips along the edge, where centuries had made the material slightly brittle but not fragile. Real vellum, not paper. The kind made from calfskin, stretched and scraped and treated with lime, expensive, reserved for important documents. The ink had that particular brown-black quality that came from iron gall, the standard for diplomatic correspondence in the 1600s. Later, when she'd finally get it carbon-dated by a lab 3 countries away, it would confirm what she already suspected. This parchment was genuinely from 1672, give or take 5 years. The handwriting matched records she'd seen. The Valdorian scribe had a distinctive way of forming his capital letters, a flourish on the V that appeared in royal documents from that period. The Mortemarch seal pressed into red wax at the bottom bore the 3 ravens that marked official state business. Every physical test she could imagine would confirm authenticity. The document was real, but the content was impossible. She read it 3 times, slowly, translating the formal diplomatic language in her head. It was a peace treaty, not a proposal, not a draft, but a ratified agreement. Both kingdoms agreed to cease hostilities along the border. Both agreed to establish a demilitarized zone extending 20 miles from the disputed river. Both agreed to exchange prisoners and allow passage for merchants. The language was specific, detailed, the kind of precision that comes from actual negotiation, not theatre. And it was dated May 3rd, 1672. Elena pulled up her laptop, fingers moving quickly across the keys. She knew what she'd find, but she needed to see it confirmed. The Chronicle of Valdoria, a primary source written by a court historian, described May 1672 inches detail. Raids, counter-raids, a village called Rothermere burned to the ground on the 2nd of May. 43 dead. On the 4th, Mortemarch forces attacked a supply convoy, killing 16 Valdorian soldiers. The Chronicle devoted 3 pages to the violence of that single week. She cross-referenced with Mortemarch records. Same story, different perspective, same dates, same war. Both kingdoms documenting their enemy's brutality, their own righteous retaliation. May 1672 was, according to 12 different historical sources from both sides, one of the bloodiest months of a very bloody conflict. And yet here was a treaty, signed by both, dated right in the middle of that violence. Elena sat back in her chair, staring at the parchment spread across the archive table. 2 possibilities existed. Either this document was an elaborate forgery so perfect that it fooled every test she could conceive, created for reasons she couldn't imagine, and hidden in an archive where no one would find it. Or the history she'd learned, the history everyone had learned, was incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily, but edited, simplified, cleaned up for a narrative that made sense. And if that was true, if a treaty this significant could simply vanish from the historical record, then what else had been quietly erased? She looked at the intertwined crests on the broken seal. 2 kingdoms that hated each other, signing peace while their soldiers killed each other's children. Unless they didn't hate each other at all. Unless someone needed everyone to believe they did. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after Elena had locked the treaty back in the archive and tried to sleep without dreaming of impossible documents. It was waiting on her desk when she arrived that morning, placed carefully on top of her keyboard, not in her mailbox, not slipped under the door. On her desk, inside her locked office. The envelope was cream-coloured, expensive, no return address. Her name was typed, not handwritten. Dr. Elena Volkov, centered perfectly. She turned it over. No seal, just a simple metal clasp. Inside, a single sheet of paper, also cream-coloured, also expensive, with a watermark she could see, when she held it up to the light, some kind of crest she didn't recognize. The message was brief. 3 sentences, typed in a font that looked almost old-fashioned, like something from a typewriter rather than a printer. The Valdoria document should remain in the archive. Your career has such promise. Some questions don't benefit from answers. Elena read it twice, then a 3rd time. Her hands weren't shaking, not yet, but something cold was spreading through her chest. She looked at her office door, still locked from the inside. She'd unlocked it herself when she arrived, which meant someone had been in here before she came. Someone with a key, or the ability to pick locks, or access she didn't know about. She hadn't told anyone about the treaty, not her department head, not her colleagues. She'd taken pictures on her phone but hadn't sent them anywhere yet. She'd written notes but kept them in a notebook that stayed in her bag. So how did anyone know what she'd found? How did they know she'd found anything at all? The letter didn't threaten, not exactly. It was too polite for that. But the politeness made it worse somehow, like someone smiling while explaining the consequences of bad choices. Your career has such promise. Translation. You have something to lose. Some questions don't benefit from answers. Translation. Asking them will cost you. Elena stood and walked to her window, looking out at the campus below. Students crossing between buildings. Faculty heading to lectures. Everything normal, everything mundane. Somewhere in that ordinary landscape was someone who wanted this forgotten document to stay forgotten. Someone who knew she'd found it within 72 hours. She went back to her desk, pulled out her phone, and began photographing the letter. If someone was watching, they'd know she wasn't stopping. But they'd also know she wasn't stupid enough to keep the only copies. To understand why the treaty was impossible, you must first understand Valdoria, not as a place on a map, but as an idea carved into stone and ice. The Kingdom of Valdoria rose from the northern mountain range like a fortress that nature itself had designed. Peaks so high that snow never melted crowned valleys so narrow that armies couldn't march through them in formation. There were only 3 passes through those mountains, 3 routes that connected the wealthy eastern kingdoms to the western markets. And Valdoria controlled all 3. This wasn't conquest. Valdoria didn't expand, didn't invade, didn't seek territory beyond what the mountains already gave them. They were guardians, or so they told themselves. They collected tolls from every caravan that passed through, every merchant seeking the eastern spice routes, every diplomat travelling between continents. The wealth that flowed through those passes made Valdoria one of the richest kingdoms in the region, despite having a relatively small population. But wealth breeds fear. And fear, in Valdoria, bred isolation. King Matthias III, who sat on the throne in 1672, embodied this philosophy perfectly. His grandfather had watched a neighbouring kingdom fall to invasion. His father had survived 3 assassination attempts by foreign agents. Matthias inherited not just a crown but a worldview. The outside world was dangerous, alliances were traps, and Valdoria's only reliable defence was the stone beneath their feet and the independence they refused to compromise. Historical records describe him as deeply religious, highly educated, and profoundly paranoid. He believed that Valdoria's wealth made them a target for every ambitious prince within 1,000 miles. He wasn't entirely wrong, but his response was to seal the kingdom tighter, to reject every diplomatic overture, to view negotiation itself as weakness. Valdoria had one unbreakable rule, enforced by 8 generations of monarchs. Never negotiate, never compromise, never trust outsiders. The mountain passes made them rich, but more importantly, they made them unreachable. Valdorian fortresses were carved into cliff faces, supplied by wells that drew from underground rivers, stocked with grain stores that could last years. They'd never been conquered because they'd never been truly threatened. Geography was their god, and isolation was their prayer. The culture reflected this. Valdorian nobles rarely travelled. They married within a small circle of families, preserving bloodlines they considered pure. Their art celebrated endurance. Their poetry praised stone and ice. Their philosophy centered on self-sufficiency. They didn't need the world. They had the passes, the mountains, and the certainty that walls, natural or built, were the only things worth trusting. So when historians say Valdoria was isolationist, they mean something deeper than foreign policy. They mean a kingdom that had built its entire identity around never bending, never opening, never letting the outside in. Which makes the existence of a treaty, any treaty with any foreign power, a fundamental contradiction of everything Valdoria believed. It would be like finding evidence that a monastery had secretly run a brothel, or that a pacifist king had maintained a hidden army. The very concept violated the core of what Valdoria was. And yet the treaty existed, signed by King Matthias III himself, bearing the royal seal, negotiated with the one kingdom that represented everything Valdoria despised. Their enemy to the south, the Principality of Mortemarch. If Valdoria was a fortress that refused to move, Mortemarch was a flood that refused to stop. The Principality sprawled across the southern lowlands like a living thing, constantly expanding, constantly consuming. Where Valdoria had mountains and 3 narrow passes, Mortemarch had rivers and fertile plains and a population that grew faster than anyone could count. They didn't guard trade routes, they created them. Their economy ran on movement, grain flowing south, manufactured goods flowing north, merchants and diplomats and soldiers travelling in every direction at once. Prince Regent Albrecht von Mortemarch ruled in 1672, though ruled understates what he did. He orchestrated. Mortemarch wasn't a traditional monarchy but something more complex, a web of noble families, merchant guilds, and military commanders that Albrecht had learned to play like an instrument. He was younger than King Matthias by 15 years, educated in 3 kingdoms, fluent in 7 languages, and driven by an ambition that court observers described as both brilliant and dangerous. Where Matthias feared the outside world, Albrecht studied it. Where Valdoria hoarded wealth, Mortemarch invested it. Where one kingdom saw threats, the other saw opportunities. But there was one opportunity Mortemarch couldn't reach: the eastern trade routes through Valdoria's mountain passes. Mortemarch's river system connected them to western markets beautifully, but the real wealth silks from the Far East, spices that sold for their weight in silver, exotic goods that only came through those 3 mountain passes remained locked behind Valdoria's walls, and Valdoria charged outrageous tolls when they allowed passage at all, which wasn't often. Matthias viewed Mortemarch merchants with particular suspicion, often denying them access entirely or imposing fees so high they made trade unprofitable. Albrecht had tried everything. He'd sent diplomats with generous trade proposals rejected without consideration. He'd offered marriage alliances that would unite the kingdoms through blood refused with insult. He'd attempted bribery, both subtle and explicit, and found that Valdorian officials couldn't be bought because they believed money from outsiders carried corruption like a disease, which left war, not as a first choice, but as the only choice remaining. The problem was geography. Mortemarch could field 3 times Valdoria's army, but numbers meant nothing when every approach led through narrow valleys where 100 defenders could stop 1,000 attackers. Mortemarch had siege equipment, engineers, cavalry trained for open field warfare, all of it useless against fortresses carved into mountainsides and supplied by resources that came from within the peaks themselves. Historical records show Albrecht's growing frustration. Letters to allies describe Valdoria as a locked door guarding a treasure no key can open. Military reports detail campaign after campaign that advanced for weeks only to stall at the mountain foothills, unable to progress further without losses that would cripple the Principality. So, the war ground on. Mortemarch raiding border villages because they couldn't reach the capital, Valdoria retaliating with ambushes in the foothills before retreating to their impregnable heights. Both sides inflicting damage, neither able to win. A permanent stalemate that bled both kingdoms year after year after year. For 37 years, Mortemarch had tried every strategy to break Valdoria's hold on the mountain passes. Negotiation failed, bribery failed, marriage alliances were rejected. War became inevitable. And yet, somehow, in the shadows of that grinding conflict, someone found another way. A secret way. One that would require both kingdoms to become something they'd never been. Willing to trust each other. The 30 Years' Border War began in 1655 over a disputed village called Rothermere. It ended in 1685 with a peace treaty that satisfied no one and changed nothing. In between, it killed somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 people, depending on which historian you trust and how you count civilian deaths. This was the war everyone knew about, the official war. The one written in chronicles, studied by military academies, referenced in diplomatic texts for centuries after, as an example of what happens when 2 kingdoms have incompatible interests and insufficient wisdom. The Battle of Crimson Valley, 1659, became famous for all the wrong reasons. 15,000 soldiers entered that valley on a spring morning. 7,000 left. The battle lasted 11 hours. No clear victor emerged, but the valley earned its name from the river that ran through it, which chroniclers said turned red from bank to bank. Both sides claimed victory in their official records. Both sides stopped fighting in that region for 2 years afterward, which tells you the real outcome. The Siege of Thornhaven, 1663 to 1664, lasted 14 months. Mortemarch forces surrounded a Valdorian border fortress, cutting off supplies, settling in for the slow starvation strategy that was their only option against mountain defences. The fortress held, not through heroism particularly, but through the simple advantage of having been built with sieges in mind, wells that drew from underground springs, grain stores in chambers carved from living rock, walls too thick for any siege engine of the era to break. When Mortemarch finally withdrew, they'd lost more soldiers to disease and desertion than Valdoria had lost to starvation. And so it went. Year after year, villages burned, populations displaced, soldiers dying in skirmishes that accomplished nothing except creating grievances that demanded retaliation. The war became generational. Farmers who'd lost fathers grew up to lose sons. Hatred stopped being about politics and became about blood. By 1672, both kingdoms were exhausted, but neither could stop. King Matthias had just lost his younger brother, Stefan, in a Mortemarch ambush near the southern pass. Stefan wasn't a soldier, he'd been inspecting toll stations, performing administrative duties. The ambush was deliberate, calculated to hurt Matthias personally. It worked. Historical records show that Matthias ordered immediate retaliation, authorizing raids that previous Valdorian policy had avoided because they risked too many soldiers for too little gain. Prince Regent Albrecht lost his cousin Henrik in March of 1672 to a Valdorian raid on a supply convoy. Henrik had been diplomatic, the one voice in Mortemarch's court arguing for renewed peace negotiations. His death silenced the peace faction entirely. Albrecht's letters from this period show a man who'd given up on diplomacy, not from preference, but from necessity. His own nobles would have seen continued negotiation attempts as weakness, possibly even treachery. The primary sources from 1672 are extensive. We're not relying on later historians interpreting scanty records. We have dozens of documents, military dispatches detailing troop movements, supply requisitions that show both kingdoms mobilizing for intensified conflict, diplomatic correspondence between neighboring kingdoms discussing the perpetual hostility and debating whether to intervene. We have chronicles written by monks in both kingdoms, recording casualties and atrocities with the dispassionate precision of men who'd seen too much death to be shocked anymore. May 1672 was particularly brutal. The village of Rothermere, the same village that had sparked the war 37 years earlier, was burned to the ground by Mortemarch forces on May 2nd. 43 dead, most of them civilians. Valdorian retaliation came on May 4th, targeting a supply convoy. 16 Mortemarch soldiers killed. On May 7th, a Mortemarch raiding party attacked a Valdorian outpost. 12 casualties. The pattern continued throughout the month: attack, retaliation, counter-retaliation, a rhythm of violence so predictable that both sides could almost schedule it. Every history book agrees on these events. Not just Valdorian and Mortemarch sources, which you might suspect of bias or propaganda. Neutral observers from 3 neighboring kingdoms recorded the same timeline of hostilities. Trade records show merchant caravans avoiding the region entirely during this period. Diplomatic letters reference the escalating conflict as a known fact, an accepted reality of the political landscape. This is documented history, verified, cross-referenced, as certain as anything from the 17th century can be. And yet, somewhere in the middle of May 1672, while villages burned and armies clashed and chroniclers recorded atrocity after atrocity, 2 kingdoms signed a peace treaty. Not a proposal, not a draft, a ratified agreement, signed and sealed by both monarchs. How do you hide peace in the middle of war? How do you negotiate in secret while your soldiers kill each other in daylight? Someone figured it out, someone made it happen, and someone decided that nobody, not the nobles, not the generals, not history itself, should ever know. Between Valdoria's mountain fortresses and Mortemarch's lowland territories stretched a region both kingdoms claimed but neither controlled: the Grey Marches. Even the name carried uncertainty, not quite border, not quite no man's land, but something in between. A strip of contested earth, where fog rolled in most mornings and rarely lifted, where forests grew thick enough to hide entire companies of soldiers, where villages changed hands so often that inhabitants stopped bothering to learn which flag flew over the nearest garrison. This was where the war was fought, mostly, not in glorious pitched battles but in ambushes and raids. Supply convoys attacked in the pre-dawn hours, patrols that disappeared and were found days later. The Grey Marches swallowed certainty. You couldn't be sure which kingdom's territory you stood in at any given moment, couldn't always tell which army the soldiers approaching through fog belonged to until they were close enough to kill you. And somewhere in the heart of this uncertain country stood the ruins of a monastery. The treaty's preamble mentioned it obliquely: at the chapel of the 3 saints, in the presence of God and neutral ground. That phrase, neutral ground, sent researchers searching through archives for a location that fit. What they found was fragmentary. Property records from a religious order that had maintained a monastery in the Grey Marches until 1667, when the war swept through and both armies, in a rare moment of shared purpose, suspected the monks of providing intelligence to the other side. The monastery was abandoned. 5 years later, it still stood empty, too damaged to be useful as a garrison, too remote to be worth rebuilding. But it existed, and critically, it could be reached from both kingdoms without crossing directly through enemy territory. Valdorian forces controlled the northern approaches to the Grey Marches. Mortemarch held the south. The monastery sat roughly equidistant from both, accessible through the network of forest paths that both armies used for patrol routes. Someone travelling from Valdoria could reach it in 2 days without ever entering land definitively held by Mortemarch. Someone coming from the south could do the same in reverse. Period maps, when you know to look for them, show the monastery's location with surprising precision. It sat near a river, one of dozens in the region, surrounded by forest that had once been carefully maintained by the monks, but had grown wild in their absence. The main chapel remained structurally intact, according to military reports from late 1671, though the roof leaked and the surrounding buildings were in various states of collapse. Weather records from spring 1672 note unusually persistent fog in the Grey Marches, even by local standards. The kind of fog that reduced visibility to 20 feet, that muffled sound, that made armies nervous because you couldn't see an ambush coming until it was already happening. Perfect conditions, in other words, for moving high-value targets through contested territory without detection. The monastery had one more crucial advantage. Nobody cared about it anymore. Both kingdoms' military planners had written it off. No strategic value, no symbolic importance. Just another ruin in a landscape full of them. Guards might patrol within a mile of it, but they wouldn't station forces there, wouldn't waste men watching a building that housed nothing but ghosts and memories of a failed attempt at neutrality. Which made it the only place where this meeting could occur. Not because it was safe, nothing in the Grey Marches was safe, but because it existed in a kind of political vacuum. A place where the normal rules of war and sovereignty had broken down so completely that two enemy rulers could, theoretically, stand in the same room, without technically violating their own kingdom's laws. The monastery had been abandoned for 5 years, caught between two armies, belonging to neither. The monks who'd once prayed for peace there had fled or died. The building itself was slowly returning to the forest, its stones covered in moss, its windows empty of glass, which made it the only place where the impossible could become real. The treaty bore 5 signatures. 5 wax seals pressed into the bottom of the document, each one a declaration of presence, of agreement, of complicity in something that couldn't be acknowledged. The first signature belonged to King Matthias III of Valdoria. Not a proxy, not an envoy, but the king himself. This alone should have been impossible. Matthias hadn't left his mountain capital in over a decade. His paranoia about assassination was so pronounced that he employed food tasters, slept in a different room each night without telling anyone which one, and refused to attend any gathering where he couldn't control every entrance. The idea of him travelling 200 miles to meet with enemies in an abandoned building would have seemed to anyone who knew him like a delusion or a trap. Yet there was his signature. The handwriting matched samples from other royal documents perfectly. The seal bore the Valdorian crest, pressed with the king's personal signet ring. Analysis confirmed the wax composition matched other seals Matthias used during this period. He had been there, physically present, in that fog-shrouded chapel. The second signature was Prince Regent Albrecht von Mortemarch's. According to official Mortemarch military records, Albrecht was 200 miles southwest of the Grey Marches on the date the treaty was signed, conducting troop inspections near the coastal fortresses. Multiple officers filed reports of his presence there, yet somehow his signature appeared on a document signed in a location he couldn't possibly have reached and returned from in the available time frame. Unless the inspection reports were fabricated, unless his generals covered for his absence, unless the entire command structure of Mortemarch's military was complicit in hiding their leader's journey to meet with the enemy. The third signature belonged to Lord Chancellor Henrik Voss, Matthias's closest advisor. Voss was known as a hawk, one of the loudest voices in the Valdorian court, arguing for continued war, for refusing any negotiation with Mortemarch under any circumstances. His presence at a peace negotiation contradicted everything his public career stood for. Either he was playing a role, deliberately appearing as a hardliner to provide cover for secret diplomacy, or something at that meeting changed his mind about the necessity of war. The fourth signature was Cardinal Wilhelm Thorn's. Mortemarch's highest religious authority, spiritual advisor to the Prince Regent, and a man whose theological writings emphasized the moral duty to resist tyranny and defend the faithful against oppression, which is how Mortemarch characterized Valdorian control of the trade routes. Thorne's presence suggested this meeting wasn't purely political. Someone wanted God's representative in the room, either to bless what was about to happen or to witness that it was done without sin. But it's the fifth signature that has consumed researchers for decades. Just 2 letters, C, M. No title, no kingdom affiliation. No seal pressed beside it. The space where a personal crest should appear is empty. Just initials written in a hand that doesn't match any known noble or diplomat from either kingdom. The ink is the same as the rest of the document, meaning this person was physically present at the signing. Their agreement was apparently necessary. You don't add a 5th signature to a treaty between 2 kingdoms, unless that person's participation matters. Theories have proliferated. Was C. M. a mediator from a 3rd kingdom, a representative of the religious order that once ran the monastery, a military commander trusted by both sides? Or something else entirely, an intelligence operative perhaps, someone who worked in shadows and whose identity had to remain hidden even on a document that was itself hidden? Elena Volkov spent 3 years trying to identify C. M. She cross-referenced every noble family, every military officer, every diplomatic functionary she could find from 1,672. She searched church records, merchant guild registries, even criminal court documents, looking for someone whose initials matched and whose position would warrant inclusion in a royal treaty. She found nothing. C. M. exists only as 2 letters on a 300-year-old document, present at one of the most significant secret meetings in European history, and then vanishing from the historical record as if they'd never existed at all. 5 men signed the treaty. 3 were identified within months of Elena's discovery. 1 took decades. The 5th signature remains unexplained to this day. And that mystery might be the key to everything. No transcript of the meeting survives. If one was ever created and given the secrecy involved, that's uncertain. It vanished along with most other evidence of this gathering. We don't know who spoke first, whether weapons were drawn, whether the initial moments were marked by hostility or cautious courtesy. We don't have the words that passed between men who had spent years ordering each other's soldiers killed. But we have the treaty itself, and a treaty is, in its way, a record of negotiation. Every clause represents something that was proposed, debated, and ultimately agreed upon. The document becomes a map of the conversation, if you know how to read it. The opening clause addresses territorial integrity. Both kingdoms agree to recognize existing borders and cease military operations in contested regions. Standard language for a peace treaty, the kind of thing you'd expect. But the second clause goes further. Both kingdoms agree to allow limited passage of each other's merchants through previously restricted territories. Not just peace, but economic cooperation. That represents a significant concession from Valdoria, the kingdom that had built its entire foreign policy around controlling access to the mountain passes. The third clause introduces something unexpected: shared intelligence regarding third-party threats. Both kingdoms agree to exchange information about forces hostile to mutual interests. That phrase is careful, diplomatic, but it points toward a reality both leaders must have confronted. They weren't the only powers in the region. They weren't even the most dangerous. This is where historical context becomes crucial. In 1672, the Holy Slavonian Empire was expanding westward, systematically absorbing smaller principalities through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation. Intelligence reports from that period, declassified only in the 1992, when they were deemed too old to matter, show Slavonian military planners specifically discussing Valdoria's mountain passes as targets for future campaigns. Control those passes, and you control trade between Eastern and Western Europe. Control that trade, and you fund further expansion. Matthias and Albrecht would have known about Slavonian ambitions. They would have understood that their decades-long war had weakened both kingdoms to the point where neither could resist a determined Slavonian invasion. Separately, they were vulnerable. Valdoria's mountain fortresses were strong, but they had limited manpower. Mortemarch had armies, but armies need supplies and funding that 30 years of war had depleted. Together they controlled defensible terrain and sufficient military force to make Slavonian expansion costly enough to discourage. Together they could coordinate intelligence, pool resources, present a unified front that would force Savonia to seek easier targets elsewhere. The middle sections of the treaty outline exactly this kind of cooperation: joint defensive planning, coordinated economic development, even provisions for limited military exercises conducted together, which would have been unthinkable just months earlier. This wasn't a truce. This wasn't even just peace. This was a proposal for alliance. The final clause is perhaps most revealing. Both parties agree that the terms of this treaty will remain confidential until such time as both monarchs determine public revelation would serve mutual interests. In other words, this alliance would remain secret for as long as necessary, possibly forever. Why? Because neither leader could admit to their own people what they'd done. Matthias's court would see negotiation with Mortemarch as betrayal, weakness, proof that the war they'd suffered through for decades had been for nothing. Albrecht's nobles, many of whom had lost family members to Valdorian raids, would view secret alliance as cowardice or treason. The populations of both kingdoms had been raised on stories of enemy atrocity. Generations had grown up believing the other side was fundamentally hostile, incapable of reason, worthy only of defeat. To announce this alliance publicly would risk rebellion in both kingdoms simultaneously, so it would remain hidden. A secret partnership between public enemies. They went in as enemies. They emerged as allies. And neither could ever acknowledge what they'd agreed to, because admitting it would destroy them both. But signing a document is one thing. Making it real is something else entirely. The treaty Elena found was divided into two sections. The division wasn't obvious at first. No dramatic line separating one from the other. No warning that what came after was different from what came before. But as she read through the document that first night, translating the formal diplomatic language into something her tired brain could process, she began to notice a shift in tone, in specificity, in the weight of what was being proposed. The first section contained what you might expect from a peace treaty negotiated between exhausted enemies, standard diplomatic language, the kind that had ended countless wars throughout European history, practical terms for stopping the violence and establishing some framework for coexistence. Article 1 addressed territorial claims. Both kingdoms agreed to recognize existing borders as legitimate and permanent. No land would be surrendered, no villages transferred from one kingdom to another. Whatever territory you held at the moment of signing, you kept. This suggests something important. Neither side was winning. After 30 years of war, after tens of thousands of casualties, both kingdoms stood essentially where they'd started. The treaty acknowledged this stalemate without stating it explicitly, allowing both monarchs to claim they'd defended their realm successfully, while quietly admitting neither could defeat the other. Article 2 dealt with prisoners. Both kingdoms held thousands of captives, soldiers captured in raids, nobles ransomed but never paid for, civilians taken during village burnings who'd been absorbed into the enemy's population. The treaty mandated gradual exchange over 5 years. Not immediate release, which would have raised questions about why, suddenly, prisoners were being freed. But slow, careful repatriation that might be explained as individual negotiations or unofficial arrangements. The language is specific about numbers. No more than 200 prisoners annually, spread across multiple border crossings to avoid concentration that might draw attention. Think about what that means. Families who'd given up hope of seeing their sons, husbands, fathers again. Soldiers who'd spent years in dungeons waiting for ransom that never came. All of them could have gone home, could have been reunited, could have resumed lives the war had interrupted. The treaty provided for it, stipulated the mechanisms, created the framework for mercy. It never happened. Not one prisoner was exchanged under these terms. The families kept waiting. The soldiers stayed in their cells. Article 3 addressed trade. Here the treaty becomes more innovative, showing actual negotiation rather than just codification of stalemate. Valdoria agreed to allow Mortemarch merchants access to the mountain, passes the core issue that had triggered the war in the first place. But the access came with conditions. Reduced tolls, yes, but not eliminated. Guaranteed passage, but only for specific goods categories. Priority for Valdorian merchants during peak seasons. It's compromise in the truest sense. Neither side getting everything they wanted, both getting enough to claim victory. The toll reduction alone would have transformed both economies. Mortemarch merchants would have gained access to eastern markets, that had been locked away for decades. Valdorian coffers would have filled with steady revenue from increased traffic, rather than sporadic income from limited passage. Trade generates trade, open those routes, and wealth flows both directions. Also never implemented, the passes remained closed to Mortemarch merchants, the tolls stayed punitive, the mountain trade continued as monopoly rather than opening to competition. Article 4 covered military demobilization. Both kingdoms agreed to reduce standing forces along the border by 30% over 3 years, redeploying soldiers to northern and southern frontiers away from each other. Fewer soldiers facing each other across the Grey Marches meant fewer opportunities for incidents that could reignite full-scale war. It was tension reduction through practical military withdrawal. Never happened. Troop levels stayed constant. If anything, both kingdoms reinforced border positions in the years following 1672. Every clause in this first section was reasonable, pragmatic, and achievable. Any competent diplomat could have negotiated these terms. Any rational monarch would have implemented them, given the benefits they offered: peace without surrender, prosperity without humiliation, lives saved, families reunited, commerce restored. None of it happened. The prisoners stayed imprisoned. The borders stayed militarized. The trade routes stayed closed. The war continued exactly as it had before, as if the treaty had never been signed. Because implementing these clauses would have required acknowledging the treaty's existence, and acknowledging the treaty meant revealing what came after these opening articles. The second section, the private clauses, the terms that explained why peace couldn't be made public. Page 7 of the treaty begins with a phrase in Latin, set slightly apart from the text above it: Quae sequuntur sub sigillo perpetuo. What follows remains under perpetual seal. Everything before that phrase was merely prelude. Everything after changed the nature of what this document represented. The first private clause establishes a joint intelligence apparatus. Both kingdoms agree to share all information regarding Savonian military movements, diplomatic initiatives, and strategic planning. Not just major troop deployments, but everything which Savonian nobles were meeting with, which foreign ambassadors, which trade agreements Savonia was negotiating, which smaller states were being pressured into alliance or absorption. The clause specifies mechanisms: encrypted messages delivered through neutral couriers, regular intelligence summaries compiled by both kingdoms' spy networks, immediate notification of any development that might affect mutual security. This meant Valdorian agents operating in Savonian courts would report to both King Matthias and Prince Regent Albrecht. Information gathered at considerable risk, sometimes at the cost of lives, would flow to both kingdoms simultaneously. The intelligence services of sworn enemies would function as a single organization. The second private clause addresses military coordination. If Savonia invades either kingdom, the other provides immediate military assistance. The language is specific. Valdoria would send mountain-trained infantry and defensive fortification experts to Mortemarch if needed. Mortemarch would send cavalry and siege equipment to Valdoria if required. But more striking is what the clause anticipates: joint military exercises to be conducted secretly, presumably in the Grey Marches, to ensure forces from both kingdoms could operate together effectively when actual invasion occurred. Soldiers who'd spent years trying to kill each other would train side by side, learning each other's tactics and signals. The third clause proposes economic integration over 20 years. Not sudden merger, which would be impossible to hide, but gradual interweaving of both kingdoms' economies until they functioned as a single trading bloc. Valdorian mining operations would supply Mortemarch foundries at cost. Mortemarch agricultural surplus would feed Valdorian mountain garrisons at subsidized prices. Joint investment in infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports that would serve both kingdoms. Most remarkably, the clause suggests eventual currency integration, though it acknowledges this might require a generation or more to implement without raising suspicion. 20 years. These leaders were planning not just for their own reigns but for their successors. They were attempting to create something that would outlast them, that would bind both kingdoms so thoroughly that eventually the fiction of enmity would become unnecessary because the reality of alliance would be undeniable. The fourth clause establishes what it calls shared diplomatic representation. In practice, this meant creating a secret diplomatic corps, ambassadors who would appear to represent only their home kingdom, but would actually advance interests of both. A Valdorian envoy in France, would push for policies that benefited both Valdoria and Mortemarch, while maintaining the fiction of rivalry. A Mortemarch ambassador in the Holy Roman Empire would protect Valdorian interests as carefully as their own. Imagine the complexity. An ambassador must negotiate treaties that appear to favour their kingdom while secretly ensuring they also serve their supposed enemy. They must participate in discussions about balancing power between Valdoria and Mortemarch, while knowing that balance is theatrical, that behind the performance both kingdoms function as one. They must lie convincingly, not just to foreign courts, but to their own colleagues, their own staff, possibly their own families. The fifth clause addresses succession. If either monarch dies without an heir of their own bloodline, the other monarch gains first right to propose a successor to the deceased ruler's nobility. Not automatic succession that would reveal the alliance, but significant influence over who inherits the throne. Over time, this clause would gradually align both kingdoms' ruling families until eventually they merged completely, uniting the crowns through marriage and inheritance rather than conquest. Read together. These private clauses don't describe a peace treaty. They describe a covert unification. Two kingdoms, maintaining every external appearance of separation and hostility, while functioning internally as a single political entity. Independent governments publicly, integrated alliance privately. The fiction of war, preserving the reality of cooperation. The sophistication is remarkable. This wasn't hastily drafted during a single meeting. Someone, possibly multiple someones, had thought through every aspect of how two kingdoms could merge, without appearing to merge, could become allies without admitting alliance, could function as one while appearing as two. But sophistication doesn't mean workability. The private clauses required thousands of people to maintain the deception. Spies reporting to two masters, diplomats serving two kingdoms while admitting to neither, soldiers training together in secret while raiding each other publicly, merchants conducting illegal trade through elaborate chains of intermediaries, officials in both governments coordinating policies while pretending to compete. Everyone involved would need to keep the secret, not just for months or years, but potentially for decades. And secrets kept by thousands of people don't stay secret. Unless you build in enforcement mechanisms, unless you create systems to ensure silence, unless you make the cost of revelation so high that even those who might doubt the wisdom of the arrangement dare not speak. The private clauses created the alliance, but making it work required something darker. Following the private clauses, the treaty shifts tone again. The language becomes more technical, more specific, more concerned with practical mechanics than grand strategy. This section addresses a question that must have dominated much of the secret meeting. How do you actually do this? How do you make two kingdoms function as one while appearing to remain enemies? The answer, it turns out, required building an entirely new structure of governance, shadow institutions that would coordinate everything while remaining invisible. First, the establishment of what the treaty calls the Coordinating Council. Later documents would refer to it as the Council of Seven, 3 representatives from Valdoria, 3 from Mortemarch, and a 7th member who would serve as neutral arbiter, quite possibly the mysterious CM, whose identity remains unknown. This council would meet quarterly, always in the grey marches, always in secret. They would coordinate all aspects of the dual policy: intelligence sharing, military planning, economic integration, diplomatic initiatives, and most crucially, the management of continued public hostility. The council would operate with absolute authority over matters relating to the alliance. Neither monarch could unilaterally change the treaty's terms. Both would have to bring proposals to the council for debate and vote. The neutral 7th member would break ties. It's a remarkable surrender of sovereignty, both Matthias and Albrecht agreeing to subordinate their own authority to a joint body that included their enemies' representatives. Second, the choreography of conflict. This section is disturbing in its clinical precision. Both kingdoms would continue military operations along the border, but these operations would be pre-coordinated through secret channels to minimize casualties while maintaining appearance of genuine warfare. The treaty specifies acceptable casualty limits, no more than 200 deaths annually, combined total from both sides. Battles would be scheduled in advance when possible. Targets would be chosen for maximum theatrical value and minimum strategic importance. Villages near the border, those unfortunate enough to lie in the grey marches, could still be raided, but civilian casualties were to be avoided where feasible. 200 deaths per year. The treaty called them necessary losses in maintenance of public credibility. It's a cold calculus. This many deaths make the war seem real, without significantly depleting either kingdom's military capacity. Acceptable losses. Acceptable to whom? Not to the 200 who would die, certainly. Not to their families, but acceptable to the monarchs who needed the war to appear genuine while the alliance operated in shadow. Third, economic coordination through intermediary networks. Both kingdoms would continue publicly, maintaining trade restrictions and embargoes, but privately, commerce would flow through neutral third parties. Merchants in bordering states would serve as cutouts buying Valdorian goods and reselling them to Mortemarch, buying Mortemarch products and routing them to Valdoria. The kingdoms would secretly subsidize these intermediaries to ensure their cooperation and silence. Over time, these neutral merchants would become wealthy, facilitating illegal trade while appearing to serve no particular kingdom. Fourth, the systematic falsification of history. Official chroniclers from both kingdoms would continue documenting the war, recording atrocities and battles, and maintaining the narrative of implacable hostility. But these chronicles would be coordinated behind the scenes to ensure both sides told compatible stories that reinforced rather than contradicted each other. The treaty suggests that the Council of Seven would review major historical documents before publication to ensure they served the alliance's interests while appearing to serve their respective kingdoms. History as propaganda. Truth as a casualty not just of war but of the secret peace that replaced war. Fifth, enforcement provisions. The treaty doesn't elaborate extensively, but several clauses make clear that maintaining secrecy would require coercion as much as loyalty. Anyone who learned of the alliance and threatened to reveal it would face execution as a traitor in both kingdoms, a unique punishment that guaranteed death whether you fled to friend or enemy. Key participants would swear loyalty oaths, binding them to silence on penalty of not just their own death but their families. The treaty mentions surety provisions, understood by researchers to mean hostages. Your wife held comfortable but captive in the enemy capital, while you serve the alliance guarantees your continued cooperation. The framework transformed the treaty from aspiration into operational plan. Every contingency anticipated, every obstacle addressed, every mechanism for maintaining the dual reality carefully specified. On paper, it could work. Two kingdoms appearing to fight while actually functioning as allies, protected from external threat while avoiding internal revolution, gradually integrating until the fiction became unnecessary. But maintaining the lie required 200 deaths per year, required systematic deception of entire populations, required false history and controlled information, and coerced silence. And it required something else, something the treaty's main signatories might not have fully understood when they signed. A hidden provision that would ensure the alliance's continuation, or destroy everything if discovered. Elena had stared at the treaty for 3 weeks before she noticed it. Not the main text, she'd translated every word of that within days, cross-referenced dates, verified signatures, catalogued inconsistencies. But there, in the margin of page 14, where the implementation framework concluded, was something she'd initially dismissed as deterioration, a smudge. Water damage, perhaps, or the shadow of text from the reverse side bleeding through old parchment. But smudges don't have structure, and under the magnifying glass she'd borrowed from the conservation department, this smudge resolved into letters. Abbreviated Latin, written in a hand distinctly different from the formal script of the main document. Smaller, hurried, almost furtive. Articulus occultus testimonium in reliquary. Hidden article, testament in the reliquary. She sat back from the desk, feeling something cold settle in her chest. Treaties didn't have hidden articles. They were complete documents, comprehensive by nature. You didn't sign a binding agreement and then mention, oh, by the way, there's more text stored somewhere else, unless what you'd written was too dangerous to include even in a secret treaty. Unless you needed separation, distance, deniability. But what reliquary? The word was specific, not box, not container, not archive. A reliquary was a religious object, an ornate case holding sacred relics, saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, objects of veneration housed in churches and cathedrals, protected by religious authority rather than political power. Clever, actually. Political archives could be seized, searched, destroyed when regimes changed, but religious institutions had their own sovereignty, their own protections. A document hidden in church custody might survive precisely because no one thought to look for state secrets among holy remains. Elena began searching records of religious properties in the Grey Marches region. Most churches from that era were gone, destroyed during the war, abandoned afterward, or demolished in later centuries. But the monastery at the treaty-signing location had belonged to a specific order, and religious orders kept meticulous records. If something from that chapel had been moved, someone would have noted where. She found it in an inventory compiled in 1689, 17 years after the treaty signing. A dry, bureaucratic document listing church properties transferred during consolidation of dioceses. Item 47. The Reliquary of St. Erasmus. Silver work with enamel detailing, removed from the Chapel of the Three Saints, now defunct, to the Episcopal Archives of Thornmark for preservation. Thornmark. A cathedral city 200 miles from the Grey Marches in what had been neutral territory. The kind of place where archives accumulated, where documents went not to be examined but to be safely forgotten. Elena made inquiries. Careful, indirect inquiries, because the letter she'd received 3 weeks earlier still sat in her desk drawer, a reminder that someone was watching. The Thornmark Episcopal Archives existed, maintained by the cathedral chapter, theoretically open to researchers though rarely visited. She filed a formal request to examine inventory records from the late 17th century. Specifically, she did not mention reliquaries, treaties, or the names of any kingdoms involved. It took 21 years. Not because the archives were uncooperative, but because the process of gaining access, establishing credibility, navigating bureaucratic procedures, and finally, in 2003, being allowed into the climate-controlled vault, where precious objects were stored, required patience that bordered on obsession. The reliquary of St. Erasmus was smaller than she'd expected. Silver, tarnished to a dark grey, with enamel work depicting scenes from the saint's martyrdom. Beautiful craftsmanship. The kind of object that would have held a finger bone, perhaps, or a fragment of cloth that had touched holy remains. The conservator who accompanied her opened it carefully, revealing red silk lining and a small compartment. Empty. As expected, whatever relic it once held was long gone, likely transferred elsewhere or lost during one of many religious reforms across 3 centuries. But Elena had read enough about reliquaries to know they sometimes had hidden compartments, secret spaces where valuables could be concealed beneath the obvious contents. She asked the conservator to examine the base. He found the false panel almost immediately a thin sheet of silver that lifted away to reveal a second cavity. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but was now the colour of old bone, lay a folded parchment. The conservator's hands were steady as he unfolded it. Elena's were not. The document was brief, just 12 lines of text, 5 signatures at the bottom, identical to those on the main treaty. She read the first line and understood why it had been separated. Why it had been hidden not just in an archive but in a reliquary, disguised as something sacred, protected by religious rather than political authority. The treaty was shocking enough. But this was the real purpose. Everything else had been preamble. The Articulus Occultus was dated the same day as the main treaty, May 3rd, 1672, but written in different ink on different parchment, as if composed separately and added as an afterthought, or as if it had always been the true objective, with the treaty itself serving as framework for this deeper plan. 12 lines. That's all it took to reveal a conspiracy that reached beyond alliance into something European nobility would have recognized as a coup against the very concept of independent kingdoms. The hidden article specified a marriage arrangement, not proposed, not suggested, specified. Within 10 years, the royal families of Valdoria and Mortemarch would be joined through double marriage alliances so comprehensive that their descendants would have undeniable claim to both thrones simultaneously. First marriage, Princess Caroline of Valdoria, King Matthias's only daughter, aged 7 in 1672, would wed Victor von Mortemarch, Prince Regent Albrecht's nephew and designated heir, age 9. Second marriage, occurring simultaneously. Prince Edouard of Valdoria, Matthias's nephew, and second in line for the throne, age 12, would marry Katharina von Mortemarch, Albrecht's daughter, age 10. 4 children who'd never met, whose kingdoms were supposedly locked in generational war, whose families were bitter enemies according to every chronicle and document and diplomatic correspondence. 4 children whose marriages were being arranged in secret by men who publicly continued ordering soldiers to kill each other. But the marriages themselves weren't the conspiracy's most disturbing element. Royal families had arranged matches for political advantage throughout history. What made this different was the timeline and the deception embedded in it. The hidden article specified that these marriages would not occur immediately. They would wait 8 to 10 years, until the children reached appropriate age, and until the language is careful here. Circumstances permit public revelation. Translation: until the Savonian threat had been managed, until both kingdoms' populations could be prepared, until the fiction of war could be safely discarded. When the marriages were finally announced and celebrated, they would be presented as a new generation's peace initiative. Young royals, untainted by their parents' hatreds, choosing love and alliance over inherited enmity. The kingdoms would merge officially, revealed as natural consequence of romantic diplomacy rather than calculated conspiracy. History would record that Prince Edward and Princess Katerina, Prince Victor and Princess Caroline, had ended a war through courage and vision. The truth that their marriages had been arranged years earlier by the same fathers who'd prosecuted that war would remain hidden. The treaty would stay in its sealed box. The Articulus Occultus would remain in its reliquary, and an entire generation would believe that peace came from the younger generation's idealism, rather than the older generation's realpolitik. The article included provisions for managing the children as they matured. By age 15, each would be gradually brought into the secret. Not told everything immediately, but introduced to the reality that their kingdoms weren't truly enemies, that their eventual marriages served a purpose beyond personal happiness, that they were part of something larger than themselves. The language describes this process as education in necessity. The children would learn that their parents had made alliance to protect both kingdoms from external threat. They would understand that maintaining the appearance of hostility served strategic purposes. They would be bound by the same oaths, subject to the same threats, complicit in the same deception that controlled their parents. By the time they married, they wouldn't be innocent victims of arranged matches. They'd be conscious participants in the conspiracy, continuing what their parents began. The scope is breathtaking. This wasn't just about ending a war or forming an alliance. This was about fundamentally reshaping European political geography by merging 2 rival kingdoms through biological inevitability. Within 2 generations, distinction between Valdoria and Mortemarch would become genetic fiction. The mountain fortresses and lowland armies would belong to a single royal line. A power block would emerge that could dominate the entire region. And it would be remembered as a love story. 4 young people overcoming their parents' prejudices, choosing peace over war, unity over division. Poets would write about it. Chroniclers would celebrate it. Future generations would point to these marriages as proof that even the deepest hatreds could be overcome through courage and vision. None of them would know that the marriages were arranged in secret years before the couples met. That the war continuing in the background was partially theatrical, casualties carefully managed to maintain credibility. That the peace they celebrated had been planned by the same men who'd ordered the violence. The soldiers who died in the years between the treaty signing and the eventual marriages, hundreds, perhaps thousands, would be remembered as casualties of a war that ended through love. But the truth was darker. Their deaths were managed theatre, acceptable losses in service of a predetermined merger. They died so that a conspiracy could remain hidden long enough to be revealed as romance. 4 children, ages 7 to 12, had their futures decided in secret by men who would tell them and the world that their eventual marriages were spontaneous peacemaking gestures. The war was real. The peace would be staged. And the children would never know they'd been pawns since before they were old enough to understand what kingdoms were, let alone why they fought. The hidden article was 12 lines long. But those 12 lines rewrote everything. The treaty wasn't the plan. It was preparation. The marriages were the plan. Everything else, the peace terms, the alliance provisions, the intelligence sharing existed to create conditions where 4 children could be married off, and 2 kingdoms could merge while everyone believed it happened naturally. Except it didn't happen. Something went wrong. The treaty was signed in May 1672. By September of that same year, people started disappearing. Not obviously. Not in ways that would draw attention or raise immediate alarm. But carefully reconstructing the months following the secret meeting reveals a pattern of absences, withdrawals, and deaths that suggests the conspiracy began unraveling almost immediately. Cardinal Wilhelm Thorn resigned his position as Mortemarch's chief religious authority in August 1672, 3 months after signing the treaty. The official reason was vague complaints about fatigue, difficulty fulfilling his duties, need for spiritual retreat. He withdrew to a monastery in the countryside, far from the court where he'd served for 20 years. He never appeared publicly again. Contemporary accounts mention him only twice more. In late 1673, a letter from the monastery's abbot requests prayers for Cardinal Thorn, who is suffering from what the abbot describes as affliction of the spirit, language that could mean depression, mental breakdown, or possibly guilt so profound it manifested as physical illness. In early 1674, a death notice records that Cardinal Wilhelm Thorn passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 53 years old. The cause of death is not specified. Affliction of the spirit. It's the kind of phrase that means everything and nothing. But for a man who'd signed a secret treaty creating alliance between enemy kingdoms, who'd participated in planning marriages for children too young to consent, who'd used his religious authority to bless a conspiracy that required ongoing deception and controlled violence, affliction of the spirit seems almost inevitable. Unless it wasn't guilt, unless it was fear, or unless it wasn't natural death at all, and the vague language concealed something more sinister. The second disappearance is more absolute. C.M. The mysterious fifth signatory, the neutral seventh member of the Council of Seven, vanishes from every record after May 1672. No death notice, no mention in any subsequent document from either kingdom, no trace in church records, military rosters, or merchant guild registries. Researchers have spent decades searching for someone whose initials match and whose position would warrant inclusion in a royal treaty. They've found nothing. It's as if C.M. never existed, but the signature is there, pressed into the parchment, written in the same session as the others. Someone sat in that chapel, witnessed the treaty, added their name, and then disappeared so completely that 3 centuries later we can't identify them. That level of erasure doesn't happen accidentally. People leave traces, property records, family connections, financial transactions. To vanish this thoroughly requires either extraordinary care in hiding or forcible elimination followed by systematic destruction of all evidence of existence. The third disappearance is structural rather than personal. The Council of Seven was supposed to meet quarterly to coordinate the alliance's implementation. Records show they convened once July 1672, 2 months after the treaty signing. The meeting took place in the Grey Marches, presumably at or near the monastery where the treaty was signed. After that, nothing. No evidence of further meetings, no coordination, no implementation of the treaty's provisions. The intelligence sharing didn't happen. The military exercises weren't conducted. The gradual economic integration never began. The marriages weren't arranged publicly or privately. It was as if the treaty had never been signed. But the war continued. More than continued, it intensified. Historical records from late 1672 show a sudden escalation in hostilities, larger battles, higher casualties, more aggressive tactics from both sides. The Battle of Ashford Ridge, October 1672, resulted in 4,000 deaths in a single day. It was the bloodiest engagement of the entire 30-year conflict. Both kingdoms committed forces far larger than normal border skirmishes. Both fought with unusual determination. Contemporary chroniclers describe it as savage. Note that neither side took many prisoners. Observe that the violence seemed almost desperate. 4,000 men died 5 months after their kings signed a peace treaty. Why? Several theories exist, none entirely satisfactory. Theory 1. The treaty was discovered by hostile forces within one or both governments. The intensified warfare was demanded by nobles or military commanders who'd learned of the conspiracy and forced their monarchs to prove loyalty through bloodshed. Theory 2. Cardinal Thorn suffered that affliction of the spirit because he'd threatened to expose the conspiracy. His removal to a monastery wasn't retirement, it was containment. His death wasn't natural, it was silencing. The other conspirators, frightened by how close they'd come to exposure, abandoned the entire plan. Theory 3. The Savonian threat that motivated the treaty changed or vanished, removing the necessity for alliance. Without external pressure forcing cooperation, old hatreds reasserted themselves and the conspiracy collapsed. Theory 4. Someone betrayed the conspiracy from within. The disappearances weren't voluntary. They were eliminations. And the intensified warfare was a message from whoever discovered the treaty. We know what you did, and now you'll prove your loyalty with blood. 4,000 men died in October 1672. Their deaths proved something, that the hatred was real, that peace had never been discussed, that the treaty hidden in a sealed box didn't exist. Except it did exist, in an archive, in a reliquary, waiting 3 centuries to reveal that the bloodiest battle of the war might have been staged to cover up a failed peace. The treaty's architects had anticipated many threats: foreign spies discovering the conspiracy, rival kingdoms exploiting the secret alliance for their own advantage. Even the possibility that Savonian intelligence might learn about the plan and use it to drive wedges between the supposed allies. What they hadn't anticipated was their own people noticing the peace. Lord General Caspar von Steinholtz commanded Valdoria's southern armies. He'd served King Matthias for 15 years, won battles that earned him noble title, and lost enough soldiers to enemy action that he took Mortemarch's threat personally. He was loyal, capable, and crucially observant. His private diary, discovered among his family papers 2 centuries later, contains an entry from late June 1672, 6 weeks after the treaty signing. The handwriting is controlled, but the content reveals growing unease. Summoned to emergency council with fellow commanders, we speak carefully, testing whether others share our concerns. They do. His Majesty's recent orders defy tactical sense. We were positioned to capture the western ford. Mortemarch supply lines are vulnerable there. Instead, ordered to withdraw and reinforce positions that need no reinforcement. When I questioned the strategy, I received no answer, only new orders to maintain defensive posture. Von Steinholtz wasn't a paranoid man. He was a professional soldier who understood that tactics exist for reasons. When those reasons disappeared, when orders stopped making strategic sense, when opportunities were deliberately ignored, you looked for explanations. He found patterns. Operations that should have proceeded were delayed without explanation. Intelligence gathering in certain regions, particularly the Grey Marches, was suddenly restricted. Aggressive campaigns that had been discussed for months were quietly shelved. And most tellingly, the king seemed reluctant to commit forces to any engagement that might produce decisive results. To von Steinholtz, this looked like one thing: secret negotiation. Matthias was either planning to surrender or had already made arrangements with the enemy. Either possibility was treason. He wasn't alone in his suspicions. The diary mentions members of the True Council, a telling phrase suggesting an alternative power structure emerging within Valdoria's military and noble leadership. These were men who'd spent years fighting Mortemarch, who'd lost friends and family to the conflict, who viewed compromise with the enemy as betrayal of everything they'd sacrificed for. The conspiracy that was supposed to save both kingdoms had inadvertently created a counter-conspiracy. Von Steinholtz set traps. He proposed operations specifically designed to test the king's commitment. Aggressive raids into Mortemarch territory that any monarch serious about winning the war would approve. Matthias found reasons to delay each one. The general's suspicions hardened into certainty. In July 1672, von Steinholtz and a delegation of senior commanders requested formal audience with the king. The diary describes the meeting in careful language. Von Steinholtz knew his words might be read by hostile eyes someday. But between the formal phrases, the confrontation is clear. They demanded assurance of His Majesty's commitment to Valdoria's independence and eternal opposition to Mortemarch treachery. It was phrased as a request, but functioned as an ultimatum. Prove you haven't betrayed us, or we'll assume you have. Matthias was trapped. He couldn't explain the treaty without exposing it, and exposure meant execution for treason by the very men standing before him. But refusing to demonstrate renewed commitment to the war would confirm their suspicions and likely trigger a coup. Von Steinholtz's diary entry after the meeting is brief but revealing. His Majesty provided all assurances required, spoke eloquently of eternal hostility to Mortemarch, of continued prosecution of war until absolute victory. His words were perfect, but his eyes revealed what his words denied. He was lying, and he knew that I knew. The secret treaty had created an impossible situation. The very secrecy that protected it from external enemies made it vulnerable to internal observation. The cessation of aggressive operations necessary to implement the alliance looked identical to surrender preparation. The careful reduction in hostilities that was supposed to save lives appeared to loyal generals as dangerous weakness. Matthias had two choices: explain the treaty and face immediate execution for treason, or prove the treaty didn't exist by demonstrating such overwhelming commitment to the war that no one could doubt his intentions. He chose demonstration. He chose blood. The treaty's greatest threat didn't come from enemies who discovered it. It came from loyal subjects who noticed the peace and decided it was betrayal. And in trying to prove them wrong, Matthias would stage one of the war's most horrific battles, killing thousands to protect a secret meant to save lives. The Battle of Ashford Ridge began on October 14th, 1672, 5 months after the secret treaty was signed. It lasted 3 days. 4,000 men died. And in purely military terms, it accomplished nothing. Ashford Ridge held no strategic value. Military historians examining the battlefield's location have noted this for decades. It's one of the war's curious footnotes. This massive engagement fought over ground that didn't matter. The ridge wasn't a supply route. It didn't guard any important position or settlement. It wasn't even particularly defensible. The terrain offered no special advantage to either force. So why did both kingdoms commit massive armies to fight over worthless ground? The answer is, in the military orders themselves, documents preserved in both kingdoms' archives that show unusual details. Normally, kings designated overall objectives and let generals handle tactical implementation. But for Ashford Ridge, King Matthias personally specified which regiments would deploy, how they would be positioned, and under what circumstances they could withdraw. He overruled his general's recommendations, insisted on troop commitments larger than the terrain warranted, and demanded engagement even when his commanders suggested the position wasn't worth the cost. Prince Regent Albrecht did exactly the same thing. Mortemarch military records show him personally directing the battle in detail that bypassed normal command structure. When his generals questioned why they were committing such large forces to such insignificant ground, Albrecht insisted. The orders were clear: engage, commit fully, accept casualties. Both monarchs were deliberately engineering a slaughter. The treaty they'd signed contained casualty limits no more than 200 deaths annually, carefully managed to maintain appearance of war without depleting military capacity. Ashford Ridge exceeded that limit in 3 days, by a factor of 20. This wasn't treaty implementation. This was treaty contradiction. Both kings staging exactly the kind of large-scale violence the treaty was designed to prevent, but staging it deliberately, personally directing the carnage for reasons their own generals didn't understand. Survivor accounts describe the battle as strange. Letters from soldiers note that both armies advanced slowly, as if reluctant. Officers hesitated to give final kill orders. The fighting, when it came, was described by one chronicler as slaughter without hatred, men killing not from animosity but from obligation, because they'd been ordered to, because their presence on that ridge demanded combat even though no one could explain why the ridge mattered. Von Steinholtz was there, commanding a significant portion of Valdoria's forces. His diary entry after the battle shows satisfaction mixed with sorrow. 4,000 dead, but his doubts about the king's loyalty had been erased. Matthias had proven his commitment. Mortemarch blood had washed away suspicion. The blood proof worked. After Ashford Ridge, no one in either kingdom questioned whether the war was real. Both monarchs had demonstrated, with bodies stacked as evidence, that they remained committed to mutual destruction. The counter-conspiracy dissolved. Von Steinholtz returned to his duties, his suspicions quieted by the violence he'd witnessed. But for Matthias and Albrecht, the battle represented something darker than military necessity. They'd signed a treaty designed to save lives, to end a war that was bleeding both kingdoms into exhaustion. 10 months later, they'd personally directed the war's single bloodiest engagement, killing more of their own people in 3 days than typically died in 3 years of border skirmishes. They'd done it to protect the treaty, to maintain the secrecy necessary for the alliance's eventual implementation, to prove to their own subjects that the peace didn't exist. And in doing so, they'd revealed the treaty's fundamental flaw. The deception required to maintain it demanded periodic demonstrations of commitment, demonstrations measured in bodies. The attempt to end the war had instead created conditions requiring spectacular violence to prove the war continued. 4,000 died to prove a lie. died so that two kings could continue pretending to be enemies while secretly planning to be allies, died because secrecy, once chosen, demanded constant sacrifice to maintain. And the cruelest part, it worked. After Ashford Ridge, no one questioned whether the war was real. Which meant the treaty, the secret alliance, the marriage plans, the hope for unified kingdoms had become not just hidden, but impossible. The treaty didn't end with a dramatic revelation or public exposure. It died quietly, piece by piece, as its architects realized what they'd created couldn't survive what it required. November 1672. Lord Chancellor Henrik Voss, one of the treaty's original signatories, sent an encrypted letter to Prince Regent Albrecht. The letter was discovered in 1998, tucked into diplomatic archives, still sealed with Voss's personal crest. Modern cryptographers decoded it, revealing desperation written in careful diplomatic language. The price of secrecy has become unsustainable. We have killed more in maintaining the deception than we would have lost by revealing it. I propose we choose: implement the treaty publicly and accept the consequences, or destroy all evidence and resume genuine war. The middle ground is drowning us in blood. Voss understood what Ashford Ridge meant. The battle had saved the secret but destroyed the purpose. You can't create peace through orchestrated slaughter. You can't build alliance on foundations of deliberately engineered carnage. The treaty had become its own opposite, not an end to war but a reason for intensifying it. Albrecht's response, also preserved, arrived 3 weeks later. The tone is defeated, almost resigned. Public implementation means execution for treason, your death and mine, likely by the same men we've tried to protect. Destruction of evidence leaves us vulnerable to whoever else possesses copies or knowledge. We are trapped in the middle space between confession and continuation, and neither offers survival. Two men who'd risked everything to create alliance, who'd planned for decades ahead, who'd imagined unified kingdoms, saving both from external threat, now corresponded about which form of failure would kill them less painfully. Meanwhile, people continued disappearing. December 1672. Thomas Grendel, a junior scribe who'd been present at the treaty signing to witness signatures and prepare copies, vanished from his home in Valdoria's capital. His family received a message from royal administration. Thomas had died in service to the kingdom. They received a generous stipend, the kind typically paid to families of state officials, executed for treason, but whose trials were kept secret to avoid scandal. His body was never found. His name appears in no trial records, but someone had decided Thomas knew too much. January 1673. Cardinal Wilhelm Thorn died in his monastery. The official record says natural causes. Contemporary gossip, preserved in letters between church officials, mentions poison, though carefully, as accusation without proof. Modern historians note the timing. 10 months after signing the treaty, as the conspiracy visibly collapsed, the man who'd provided religious authority for the plan died conveniently and quietly. The marriage plan, the hidden article's core, was falling apart as well. Prince Edward of Valdoria, one of the intended grooms, contracted a serious illness in late 1672. He survived, but remained weak. More significantly, Princess Caroline, supposed to marry Victor von Mortemarch and unite both bloodlines, was sent to a convent for education and spiritual development. She was 9 years old. Sending a royal princess to a convent wasn't unusual for education, but the timing suggests something else. Parents protecting their child from being bound into a failing conspiracy. If the treaty couldn't be implemented, better to remove the children from consideration entirely. March 1673. 10 months after the secret meeting in the Grey Marches, King Matthias issued a royal proclamation. It was read in every Valdorian city, copied and distributed throughout the kingdom, preserved in dozens of archives. The war with Mortemarch is an eternal struggle ordained by God, to continue until one kingdom or the other achieves absolute victory. There can be no peace with those who embody treachery. There will be no negotiation with those who threaten our very existence. It wasn't just propaganda, it was public repudiation of everything the treaty represented. Matthias was committing, on the record, to permanent war. Not because he believed it, though, perhaps by then he'd convinced himself, but because internal opposition demanded it. The faction that had forced Ashford Ridge required absolute assurance. This proclamation provided it. The treaty was dead. Not destroyed, it still existed, hidden in its wooden box, but dead in every practical sense. The alliance wouldn't be implemented, the marriages wouldn't occur, the integration wouldn't begin. By March 1673, every architect of the treaty understood. The conspiracy had failed, some disappeared, some died. And some, like King Matthias, publicly committed to eternal war against the very kingdom they'd secretly allied with 10 months earlier. The treaty had failed. Its implementation was impossible, its signatories dead or discredited, its purpose abandoned. The logical response would have been destruction. Burn the parchment, scatter the ashes, eliminate all evidence of a conspiracy that could posthumously destroy reputations and delegitimize royal lines for generations. Instead, someone chose preservation. Lord Chancellor Henrik Voss most likely took possession of the original document after the conspiracy's collapse. His personal papers discovered in 2007 among his descendants' family archives contain a passage written shortly before his death in 1689, 17 years after the treaty signing. I preserve what should not exist, for the day when its existence might matter. What we attempted was perhaps mad, perhaps visionary. History will judge, if history ever learns. But the judgment cannot occur if the evidence vanishes. It's a remarkable statement. Voss knew the treaty was dangerous. Its discovery could have posthumously branded him a traitor, stripped his family of titles, destroyed everything he'd built. Yet he preserved it. Not just kept it, but actively maintained it, sealed it properly, ensured its survival. Why? The simplest explanation is insurance. As long as the treaty existed, all signatories were mutually vulnerable. If someone destroyed their copy, others might retain theirs, creating asymmetric exposure, where destroyers could be accused while survivors maintained evidence of shared guilt. Mutual possession created strange trust among former conspirators. No one could safely eliminate the evidence without trusting everyone else would do the same. But there were deeper reasons. Some believed future political circumstances might make the treaty useful rather than dangerous. If Savonia eventually invaded, if both kingdoms faced existential threat, perhaps the alliance could be revived and the treaty presented as precedent. The document wasn't just evidence of past conspiracy, it was potential framework for future cooperation. And some, like Voss, felt historical responsibility. They'd attempted something unprecedented. Failed, certainly. But the attempt itself mattered. Future generations should know that peace had been possible, that alliance had been tried, that the war everyone remembered as eternal and inevitable had actually been interrupted by secret negotiation that nearly succeeded. From Voss, custody passed to his daughter when he died. She'd married into the Thornbridge family, minor nobility with extensive archives and a talent for preserving documents. The Thornbridge papers contain references to the Valdorian secret, never explicitly defined, but clearly significant. Instructions passed through generations: preserve, conceal, never destroy. By the early 18th century, descendants probably didn't fully understand what they were guarding. The treaty had become family mythology. They knew the sealed box was important, knew their ancestors had deemed it worthy of perpetual concealment, but the specific details had faded into legend. The suppression wasn't passive. Researchers examining archives from both former kingdoms found evidence of active historical editing. Pages removed from diplomatic correspondence. Diary entries scratched out so thoroughly that even modern imaging technology can't recover them. Official chronicles with suspicious gaps around May through July 1672, precisely when the treaty was signed and the conspiracy began unraveling. Someone, or multiple someones, worked systematically to remove references to the treaty from other sources. Not just hiding the document itself, but erasing its context, eliminating the traces that might lead later historians to ask uncomfortable questions about what happened during those months. The keepers, a term that appears in fragmentary correspondence, suggesting they may have used it themselves, formed an informal network. They spanned both former kingdoms, included descendants of both Valdorian and Mortemarch conspirators, and cooperated across old enemy lines to maintain a shared secret. It's a strange kind of reconciliation. The original conspiracy failed, but the suppression conspiracy succeeded. People who would have been on opposite sides of the original alliance now worked together to ensure no one learned it had been attempted. The secret became more important than the conflict that had necessitated it. The treaty moved through history like a ghost, present but invisible, preserved but hidden, protected by people who increasingly didn't know why they were protecting it, only that their ancestors had deemed it necessary. They couldn't destroy it, mutual vulnerability and historical conscience prevented that. They couldn't reveal it, treason charges might not pursue the dead, but scandal would destroy their families. So they created a new conspiracy. The conspiracy to keep the old conspiracy secret. And that suppression would outlast the kingdoms themselves, would survive into an era when Valdoria and Mortemarch were forgotten names, when the war they'd fought was obscure history studied by specialists, when the stakes that had made the treaty dangerous had vanished into irrelevance. But the secret remained, protected by people who no longer remembered why, passed through generations like a sacred trust, whose meaning had been lost, but whose importance was never questioned. The treaty should have been exposed in 1756. It nearly was. The 7 Years' War had engulfed Europe, and the Thornbridge family estate found itself in territory contested by multiple armies. Military requisitioning was standard practice, officers cataloguing noble properties for seizure, quartering, or strategic use. Lieutenant Friedrich Marlowe, a young logistics officer, was assigned to inventory the Thornbridge archives. He was educated, methodical, and cursed with curiosity. When he found the sealed wooden box among stacks of family papers, he didn't simply record it and move on. He opened it. His diary entry from May 14th, 1756, describes what he found. The translation from German is straightforward. Today discovered documents of extraordinary historical significance. A treaty between kingdoms, I recognize from history. Texts, Valdoria and Mortemarch, dated 1672, signed by monarchs bearing royal seals. The content suggests secret alliance during period recorded as unrelenting war. If authentic, this contradicts accepted historical narrative of that conflict. Marlowe understood immediately what he held. This wasn't just an interesting historical footnote. This was evidence that official history was wrong, that a war everyone believed to be straightforward enmity had contained hidden complexity, that monarchs had lied to their own people while maintaining public hostility. He faced a choice that others had faced before him, and others would face after. Report the discovery to military authorities, potentially advancing his career by providing intelligence about how noble families concealed significant documents, or honor the evident intent that this treaty remain hidden. His diary reveals his reasoning over several entries. He wasn't naive. He understood that exposing the treaty would raise questions about why the Thornbridge family had concealed it, potentially implicating innocent descendants in ancestral conspiracies. He also recognized a deeper principle. Whatever conspiracy this represents, he wrote, its participants are long dead. The kingdoms involved no longer exist in their original forms. Revelation would serve only to undermine faith in historical accounts without providing proportional truth value. Some secrets, once old enough, become historical artifacts rather than actionable intelligence. They belong to a past that cannot be changed and should perhaps remain undisturbed. It's a philosophy that recurs throughout the treaty's hidden history. Old secrets have different ethical weight than fresh ones. A conspiracy from 80 years ago, involving people now dead, kingdoms now transformed, stakes now irrelevant, does revealing it serve truth or merely satisfy curiosity? Marlowe chose concealment. But he went further than simply resealing the box. He added his own notation, written in the margin of the treaty's final page, preserved in trust for a time when truth serves better than mystery. F. M. 1756. He actively reinforced the concealment, adding a layer of oilcloth wrapping, updating the seal with his own crest alongside the older ones. He was taking responsibility for the secret, becoming part of its protection. And he wasn't alone. Researchers have found evidence of at least 4 separate discoveries between 1672 and 1850. Each time, someone found the treaty. Each time, they chose continued concealment. The reasons varied: philosophical consideration, like Marlowe's, pragmatic self-preservation like Voss's, simple family obligation for later descendants. But the pattern held. Once you possess a secret this large, you become implicated in its concealment. Revealing it requires explaining why you didn't reveal it immediately. The longer you wait, the more complicit you become in the suppression. The psychology becomes self-reinforcing. Each day of concealment makes concealment more necessary. By the 19th century, the treaty was sealed not once but multiple times, wrapped in successive layers of cloth and paper, stored in boxes nested within boxes. Each layer added by someone who'd discovered it and chosen to protect it, creating a physical manifestation of accumulating secrecy. Every person who discovered the treaty faced the same choice: expose it and become part of the story, or conceal it and protect the mystery. Every single one chose concealment. Not because they were cowards, but because they understood some secrets are too large for one person to reveal. And with each choice, the secret became more protected, more layered, more deeply hidden, even as it remained, technically, just sitting there in a box, waiting. In 1874, the Thornbridge family donated their archives to the Bavarian State Archives. It was a generous contribution: centuries of family papers, correspondence, estate records, and accumulated historical documents. Among them, catalogued simply as Valdorian Historical Documents, Unsealed, was the box containing the treaty. The treaty entered institutional custody, and in doing so, it became simultaneous more accessible and more hidden than it had ever been. Archival records show the intake process. The box was logged with reference number 14872VAL. Physical description: wooden container, approximately 12 by 18 inches, sealed, estimated weight 3 pounds. Contents: diplomatic materials, period unknown, donor restriction requests, sealed storage. The box was photographed for records, measured, assigned a shelf location in the general diplomatic documents section, and effectively forgotten. Not through conspiracy, through procedure. Modern archives are magnificent achievements of systematic organization. Every item catalogued, every location recorded, every document theoretically accessible. But that system creates its own form of concealment. The Bavarian State Archives held by 1900 over 3 million individual items. The treaty was one box among hundreds of thousands. Without knowing what it contained, you'd never know to look for it. The box was moved 3 times between 1874 and 1982 during facility relocations, reorganizations, upgrades to climate-controlled storage. Each time, it was logged, transported, and reshelved according to protocol. Each time, it remained unopened. The seals, visible in photographs from each move, stayed intact. But there's a detail in the 1874 intake records that raises questions. A handwritten notation, added by someone whose identity isn't recorded: Valdorian diplomatic materials, sensitive historical content, sealed per donor instructions. Someone knew this box was unusual, yet it was shelved in general archives, not special collections, not restricted access requiring permissions. Just general diplomatic documents, theoretically available to any researcher who requested that specific catalogue number. It's possible this was deliberate. Make the treaty accessible enough that it doesn't draw attention as a restricted document. Hide it through bureaucratic normalcy rather than explicit concealment. File it as one item among millions, knowing that researchers would need to know what they were looking for before they could find it. Similar patterns exist throughout European archives. Documents marked sensitive but not restricted. Materials sealed per donor request, without explanation of why. Items technically accessible but effectively hidden by sheer volume and lack of descriptive context. The treaty benefited from what might be called respectful concealment. Archivists honored donor instructions to keep the box sealed without necessarily knowing why. They preserved it carefully: climate control, proper storage, regular condition checks, while simultaneously ensuring it remained obscure. By 1982, when Elena Volkov began her inventory work, institutional memory had completely evaporated. The 1874 notation about sensitivity meant nothing to staff working 108 years later. The Thornbridge family's reasons for donating sealed materials were lost. The box was just another item in a section scheduled for digitization, requiring someone to finally open it and catalogue its actual contents rather than external description. Elena's discovery was partly luck. Had the box been shelved 2 rows over, in a section not scheduled for immediate digitization, it might have remained sealed for another generation. Technology eventually forces exposure. You can't digitize a sealed box. can't create catalogue records without examining contents, can't modernize archives without confronting what previous generations chose to leave obscure. But Elena's discovery also demonstrates how thoroughly institutional memory can decay. Despite the 1,874 warning about sensitivity, despite donor restrictions, despite whatever understanding had existed when the box entered state custody by 1982, no one remembered why this particular box mattered. Context had evaporated, leaving only the physical document. At what point does deliberate concealment become mere forgetting? When does suppression transition into simple archival neglect? Does the distinction matter if the result hidden history is the same? The treaty spent 108 years in an archive, catalogued and technically accessible, hidden only by the fact that no one knew to look for it. No conspiracy required, no active suppression necessary. Sometimes the best way to keep a secret isn't conspiracy, it's paperwork. File it properly, follow procedures, let bureaucratic routine do what shadowy cabals could never accomplish as efficiently. The treaty survived, not because people actively protected it, but because systems passively obscured it. Until the day a junior historian, doing routine inventory, opened a box that hadn't been opened in over a century and found evidence that history had been lying for 300 years. The treaty failed in 1672. Its terms were never implemented, its alliance never activated, its vision of unified kingdoms never realized. But history is strange. Sometimes failures leave traces. Sometimes abandoned plans shape behavior in ways their architects never intended. Historians studying Valdoria and Mortemarch had long noted peculiarities in their relationship. Small things, mostly. Anomalies dismissed as coincidence or explained away with theories about rational strategic restraint. But after Elena's discovery, researchers returned to those anomalies with new understanding. And patterns emerged that shouldn't exist if the kingdoms had been simple, straightforward enemies. The War of Spanish Succession threatened to engulf every European power. Alliances formed and reformed across the continent. Every kingdom chose sides based on strategic interests, dynastic connections, or simple survival calculation. Except Valdoria and Mortemarch. Both declared neutrality on the same day, issuing nearly identical statements about focusing on internal development and avoiding entanglement in others' conflicts. Historians had noted this but never found it particularly suspicious. Neutral states existed, but the timing was remarkable, both announcements made within hours of each other, both using similar diplomatic language, both providing explanations that conveniently allowed them to avoid fighting each other or being forced onto the same side, as if someone had coordinated their positions to ensure they remained separate but not opposed. A neighboring kingdom experienced succession crisis, leaving valuable border territory effectively ungoverned. Both Valdoria and Mortemarch had historical claims to portions of this land. Both had military capacity to seize it. Both would have benefited strategically from expansion. Neither moved. Contemporary diplomats from other kingdoms remarked on this with confusion. French observers noted that the territory lay ripe for claiming, yet unclaimed by those with greatest cause and capacity. They theorized that some secret negotiation had occurred, some division of spoils arranged, but no evidence of such negotiation existed in any archive. The kingdoms simply didn't take what they could have taken, as if respecting an invisible boundary that no treaty had drawn. Trade records reveal another pattern. Despite official embargoes maintained throughout the period, certain goods flowed between the kingdoms through elaborate intermediary chains. Valdorian iron reached Mortemarch foundries via 3 different neutral ports. Mortemarch grain fed Valdorian mountain garrisons through merchant networks so complex they required deliberate construction rather than emerging organically. The routes changed regularly, as if someone was actively maintaining them while hiding the connections. This wasn't normal black market activity. The volumes were too large, the coordination too sophisticated, the goods too strategically important. Someone on both sides was facilitating trade that officially didn't exist. Mortemarch faced genuine crisis. A coalition of neighboring powers invaded simultaneously from 2 directions, threatening to overwhelm their defenses. Valdorian generals saw the opportunity immediately, with Mortemarch's armies committed against external enemies. Their southern border with Valdoria was nearly undefended. One aggressive campaign could have seized territory that 30 years of war had failed to capture. Instead, Valdorian forces mysteriously redeployed from the southern border to address northern frontier concerns. The official explanation mentioned tribal raids and unsecured trade routes. But the effect was to leave Mortemarch's rear secure during their most vulnerable moment. They could commit full resources to the coalition threat without worrying about Valdorian exploitation. When Mortemarch survived the crisis barely and returned their attention south, they found Valdorian forces back in position as if nothing had happened. A letter from 1695, discovered in Mortemarch diplomatic archives during research following Elena's discovery, contains a phrase that stopped historians cold. Respecting arrangements made by our predecessors in matters of mutual survival. The context is vague, the reference oblique, but the recipient would have understood something that the letter doesn't explain. Modern researchers believe this references the treaty, or at least its principles, its logic, its understanding that both kingdoms shared interests requiring cooperation. The pattern suggests something remarkable. While the treaty as formal document was sealed away, forgotten by most, actively suppressed by a few, the treaty as idea persisted. Not officially, not in any document or policy statement, but in the minds of certain diplomats, certain nobles, certain strategists who knew or had been told that once, briefly, their kingdoms had recognized common cause. Ghost policy. The term researchers use now. Agreements that shape behavior without official existence. Understandings that guide decisions without being recorded. The longest-running conspiracy in European history, maintained not through active coordination but through inherited knowledge that sometimes, in certain circumstances, the official enemy was actually something more complicated. Valdoria and Mortemarch fought for 70 years, hated each other for generations, and yet they never quite destroyed each other when they had the chance. Some historians had called it restraint, others called it coincidence. But after discovering the treaty, researchers called it something else. Evidence that secret diplomacy doesn't die when treaties fail. It mutates, adapts, continues in forms its architects never intended. Genealogical research following the treaty's discovery revealed something that shouldn't exist. Persistent connection between families descended from conspirators on opposite sides of the conflict. The Voss family, descendants of Lord Chancellor Henrik Voss, the Valdorian conspirator who likely took custody of the treaty after its failure intermarried with Mortemarch nobility, 5 times between 1680 and 1750. 5 marriages across 70 years, linking families from kingdoms supposedly locked in generational hatred. Each marriage was documented, publicly celebrated, perfectly legal, but statistically improbable unless something connected these families beyond normal aristocratic marriage politics. Even more interesting, the von Steinholtz line. Remember Lord General Caspar von Steinholtz, who opposed the conspiracy, who forced King Matthias to prove his loyalty through the blood of Ashford Ridge. His descendants also married into Mortemarch families. 3 documented alliances between 1685 and 1720. This suggests something crucial. Even people who opposed the treaty became part of the secret-keeping network once they learned it existed. Opposition and conspiracy collapsed into shared knowledge requiring shared suppression. The secret became more important than the original sides. Correspondence between these families survives in various archives. Most of it is mundane estate management, marriage negotiations, social pleasantries. But careful reading reveals coded language, phrases that seem innocuous until you understand the context. Caroline Voss married Erich von Mortemarch in 1697. Her letters to her sister mention maintaining grandfather's trust and the burden of old accommodations, phrases that generations of archivists read as references to estate management and family obligations. But Caroline's grandfather was Lord Chancellor Henrik Voss, who died in 1689 after writing that he preserved what should not exist. The trust, she maintained, was likely literal, custody of the treaty or knowledge of its location. The burden was keeping that secret. Multiple descendant families established legal trusts with unusual provisions. The Thornbridge Trust, created in 1704, required trustees to maintain ancestral diplomatic archives in sealed conditions for perpetuity or until circumstances render disclosure appropriate. That's not normal language for family documents. That's a legal mechanism ensuring suppression across generations, binding descendants who might not even know what they're protecting to continue protecting it anyway. These families developed their own subculture. They intermarried more frequently than statistical probability would predict. They supported each other in business ventures and political appointments. They showed up as witnesses for each other's legal documents, as godparents to each other's children, as executors of each other's estates. Network of trust built on shared secrets and mutual vulnerability. The network persisted far beyond the 17th century, into the 18th, the 19th, arguably into the 20th, because secrets become identity. Families define themselves partly by what they know that others don't, what they guard that others shouldn't access. The conspiracy became tradition, tradition became family culture, and family culture endured even when specific knowledge of the treaty's contents faded. Which brings us to 1982. When Elena Volkov discovered the treaty, her department head was Dr. Heinrich Voss Marlow. The name itself tells a story. Direct descendant of Lord Chancellor Henrik Voss and Lieutenant Friedrich Marlow, the 1756 discoverer who chose concealment over exposure. Two branches of the secret-keeping network united through marriage in the 19th century, producing descendants who understood, at least at some level, that their families guarded something important. Heinrich Voss Marlow had pursued academic career in archival studies, specializing in Central European diplomatic history from 1600 to 1750. He'd positioned himself exactly where he might encounter information about family secrets, where he could monitor, influence, potentially control what was discovered and when. He didn't prevent Elena's discovery, probably couldn't have, as the digitization project was institution-wide policy, but he did delay official publication of her findings for 18 months. Bureaucratic obstacles, concerns about authentication, suggestions that more research was needed before going public, all reasonable, all justifiable, all buying time. For what? We don't fully know. But the descendant networks remained active, remained invested in the treaty's status even 3 centuries after it was signed. The conspiracy to keep the conspiracy secret had outlasted kingdoms, outlasted empires, outlasted the very political context that made the original treaty dangerous. Families on opposite sides of a 3-century war somehow kept intermarrying, supporting each other, protecting each other's secrets. They weren't related by blood, at least not initially. They were related by conspiracy. And that bond proved stronger than nationalism, stronger than the official hatreds their ancestors' kingdoms had maintained, stronger than generations of change that should have made the original secret irrelevant. The treaty was hidden in archives, but the knowledge of its existence, the obligation to protect it, the awareness that family honor and reputation depended on its continued concealment that lived in family culture, passed down through hints and implications, and carefully worded trusts that bound descendants to guard secrets they barely understood. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That's what historians realized after 1982, after Elena's discovery forced reconsideration of everything they thought they knew about early modern European diplomacy. The Valdoria Mortemarch Treaty became a lens. Researchers started looking at other historical relationships, other supposedly implacable enemies, other conflicts that lasted decades with curious anomalies and suspicious coincidences. They found patterns, too many patterns to dismiss. France and the Holy Roman Empire, 1,660 seconds, bitter rivals, constant border tensions, periodic skirmishes that never quite escalated to full war. Then suddenly, simultaneously, both powers de-escalated. Border incidents stopped, diplomatic rhetoric softened, trade increased through unofficial channels. This lasted exactly 3 years. Then hostilities resumed without explanation, as if a timer had expired, as if some agreement had reached its term limit. Historians had theorized various causes: economic exhaustion, internal political changes, distraction by other conflicts. But they'd never found evidence of formal negotiation. No treaty, no diplomatic correspondence, no third-party mediation, just simultaneous behavior change, followed by simultaneous return to hostility. After the Valdoria Mortemarch revelation, some researchers suggested, what if there was a treaty? What if it was suppressed, destroyed, hidden so successfully that no trace remained except the behavior it produced? This introduced methodological challenges. How do you prove something existed if all evidence was deliberately eliminated? Traditional historiography can't handle this. It relies on sources, documents, physical evidence. If those were systematically destroyed, the event becomes invisible to conventional research. So scholars developed new approaches: negative space analysis, studying what's missing rather than what's present. If multiple independent chroniclers from both sides of a conflict all have gaps covering the same dates, that suggests something more than coincidence. If diplomatic correspondence between allies suddenly stops mentioning a particular topic that had been extensively discussed, that suggests deliberate suppression rather than natural decline in relevance. Researchers applied this methodology to European archives systematically. They found dozens of suspicious patterns, clusters of missing entries, consistent silence across sources that shouldn't be consistent, diplomatic reports that reference recent accommodations without explaining what those were, letters discussing arrangements that cannot be committed to writing without specifying what arrangements. Each instance could be coincidence. Together, they suggest a broader pattern. Secret diplomacy was common, perhaps standard practice, for managing conflicts while maintaining public narratives of enmity. The implications are profound. Official history presents European conflicts as straightforward. Kingdom A hates Kingdom B. They fight. Eventually someone wins or exhaustion produces peace. But what if that's theatre? What if cooperation and conflict coexisted routinely, with public hostility masking private accommodation, with wars continuing as diplomatic cover for secret alliances? If significant portions of diplomatic history were deliberately concealed, how much of what we consider settled historical knowledge is actually curated narrative? The Valdoria Mortemarch Treaty doesn't just add one data point. It suggests systematic gaps throughout the historical record. And the pattern isn't limited to early modern Europe. In 2019, researchers analyzing Soviet diplomatic archives discovered evidence of secret cooperation agreements between USSR and USA during the Cold War regarding space technology sharing. The agreements were suppressed at the time, only declassified decades later. Enemies publicly racing to the moon were privately sharing data to prevent catastrophic failures. If enemies in the 17th century secretly cooperated while publicly fighting, and enemies in the 20th century did the same, what does that suggest about contemporary geopolitics? How many of today's conflicts might mask tomorrow's revealed cooperations? How much of international relations operates at levels invisible to public view, with official narratives deliberately constructed to serve purposes we don't understand? The treaty revealed a method: hide cooperation behind conflict, maintain public enmity while pursuing private alliance, let history record the war and suppress the peace. Use official chronicles as propaganda rather than documentation. Control information flows so thoroughly that even careful future research finds only the narrative you wanted preserved. Once you understand this method, you start seeing potential applications everywhere. Trade patterns between officially hostile nations that suggest backdoor coordination. Military conflicts that stop and start without clear cause. Diplomatic language that seems contradictory unless you assume a second layer of communication happening off record. The treaty between Valdoria and Mortemarch might not be unique. It might be one example of a common but hidden pattern that fundamentally shaped European history in ways we still don't fully understand. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If our understanding of the past is incomplete because secrets were successfully kept, how incomplete is our understanding of the present? What are we missing right now that future historians will discover and wonder how we could have been so blind? The treaty revealed that history can be a lie agreed upon by those with power to control the narrative. That revelation changes how we read every official account, how we interpret every diplomatic statement, how we trust any claim about who's allied with whom and why. You can't unsee it. Once you know secrets this large can be kept this long, you start noticing gaps everywhere. Elena Volkov discovered a treaty that had been hidden for 310 years. Then she discovered something worse. The easiest way to hide truth isn't destroying it, it's making sure no one will publish it. The document sat in her Moscow apartment for months after her return from Ravenna. She had photographed every page, translated every clause, verified every seal. The evidence was irrefutable. But evidence means nothing if no one will print it. Her first submission went to the Journal of Early Modern European History in March 1983. The methodology section alone ran 40 pages. She had documented the treaty's discovery location, its physical condition, the authentication process, chemical analysis of the paper and ink, comparison with known documents from the same period. Everything a historian could ask for. The rejection arrived 4 months later, not a detailed critique of her methods, not questions about her evidence. Just a single paragraph explaining that claims of this magnitude require extraordinary corroboration beyond current standards. She read that line a dozen times, searching for the actual criticism. There wasn't one. The journal wasn't saying her evidence was insufficient. They were saying the claim itself was too large to publish, regardless of evidence quality. Elena tried again. The Central European Historical Review received her revised submission in October 1983. This journal specialized in precisely the historical period and geographical region her discovery concerned. If anywhere would recognize the treaty's significance, it would be here. The editor assigned her manuscript to anonymous peer reviewers. Then nothing happened. 6 months passed. A year. Elena sent inquiring letters. The editor apologized for delays, explaining that reviewers were being thorough given the paper's controversial claims. 18 months after submission, the rejection finally arrived. The reviewers had concluded that alleged secret treaties, without corroborating secondary sources, fall outside the journal's publication scope. Elena stared at those words until they blurred. She was presenting a primary source, the treaty itself. Secondary sources are scholarly works that analyze primary sources. But secondary sources couldn't exist for information that had been successfully suppressed for 3 centuries. The logic was perfectly circular. She couldn't publish without secondary sources proving the treaty existed. But secondary sources couldn't exist until someone published the treaty proving it existed. Her correspondence from this period, preserved in Moscow archives, reveals mounting frustration. One letter to a colleague in Poland contains the bitter observation: "I have found what historians dream of, finding an unknown document that rewrites accepted history. And I am learning that the profession doesn't want its history rewritten." She began investigating the reviewers, though their identities were officially confidential. Academic networks are small. Careful inquiries eventually revealed names. 3 of the 5 peer reviewers who had assessed her work were senior historians at prestigious universities. 2 of them were direct descendants of families identified in the keeper genealogies. Perhaps that was coincidence. Perhaps it wasn't. Elena couldn't prove they were consciously protecting family legacies or deliberately suppressing uncomfortable truths. But she didn't need to prove conspiracy. Unconscious bias worked just as effectively. The breakthrough came accidentally. In 1987, Elena presented her findings at a small conference on archival methodologies in Prague. She wasn't even on the main program, just a 15-minute slot in a side session on unusual document preservation. A documentary filmmaker attended that session. He was researching Cold War-era archival exchanges between Eastern and Western Europe. Elena's treaty wasn't his intended subject, but he recognized its significance immediately. His documentary aired on German television in April 1988. Suddenly, Elena's discovery was public knowledge, discussed in newspapers and television programs across Europe. Academic journals could no longer quietly reject her work. The information was already circulating. Silence now would look like censorship rather than scholarly caution. Her full article appeared in print in February 1989, 7 years after she first found the treaty in Ravenna. The 17th century suppression had been effectively extended into the 20th century, not through conspiracy or violence, but through institutional gatekeeping and scholarly conservatism. The system had protected itself without anyone needing to give orders. 3 centuries after the treaty was signed, corporations used trade routes it established, nations invoke conflicts it attempted to end, and universities teach histories it contradicts. Everyone benefits from the official story. Very few benefit from the truth. The threatening letter Elena received in 1982 came from someone, not a ghost from the 17th century, a living person with a modern address and contemporary concerns. She never discovered who sent it, but her subsequent research revealed something more interesting than a single name. An entire ecosystem of interests aligned against the treaty's revelation. Begin with the universities. Major academic institutions in regions once controlled by Valdoria and Mortemarch have built their reputations on specific historical narratives. National founding myths. Stories of resistance against foreign oppression. Eternal struggle for independence. These narratives justify university funding, shape curriculum, define research priorities, and anchor national identity. The treaty complicates everything. It suggests that ancestors weren't heroes of pure resistance but participants in cynical power calculations. That the great enemies of national mythology were actually secret partners. That independence movements fought against arrangements their own leaders had helped negotiate. Elena found correspondence between historians debating whether this truth should be widely disseminated. Not whether it was true, the evidence settled that question. But whether truth that undermines national identity serves scholarly or social good. One professor wrote, "We have spent decades building historical consciousness in young people, teaching them pride in their heritage, giving them roots. Does academic honesty require us to pull up those roots?" The utilitarian calculation was explicit. Some historical lies might be preferable to disruptive truths. Then consider political entities. Modern nations occupying former Valdorian and Mortemarch territories invoke historical enmity in contemporary rhetoric. Border disputes reference ancient territorial claims. Identity movements cite centuries of oppression. Nationalist parties campaign on historical victimhood. The treaty undermines all of it. Those ancient grievances weren't inevitable ethnic hatreds but pragmatic political calculations. The territorial boundaries being defended as sacred weren't eternal natural divisions but negotiated agreements. The oppression being memorialized was partly theatre performed for public consumption, while elites collaborated privately. Elena documented a specific example. Two modern nations share a disputed border region. Both claim historical precedent for their territorial boundaries. Both invoke the Valdorian-Mortemarch conflict, each nation identifying with one kingdom and casting the other as inheritor of their historical enemy. Political speeches reference battles fought in that region. Textbooks teach children about ancestral lands and foreign invaders. The treaty reveals those boundaries were negotiable and indeed secretly negotiated. Both nations' historical claims rest on accepting the public war narrative while ignoring the private diplomatic reality. Acknowledging the treaty means acknowledging that neither side has the historical legitimacy they claim, but the most intriguing stakeholders are private interests. Elena's research revealed that several multinational corporations with significant holdings in the relevant regions descended from merchant houses operating in the 17th century. Corporate archives contained evidence of trade relationships that official histories said couldn't have existed because the kingdoms were at war. Valdorian goods moving through Mortemarch territories, shared merchant convoys, joint commercial ventures, all conducted quietly while public propaganda proclaimed total enmity. These corporations quietly benefit from modern trade relationships rooted in those ancient networks, relationships that might face legal challenges if the historical cooperation were widely acknowledged. Property rights could be questioned, commercial precedents re-examined, trade agreements scrutinized for foundations in historically suppressed arrangements. The letter warning Elena might have come from a protective academic, a worried nationalist, a cautious corporate lawyer, or a descendant of keeper families maintaining ancestral obligations. She never knew. But she understood that multiple independent actors had reasons to discourage investigation. Modern suppression doesn't require vast conspiracy, just many people with aligned interests making individual decisions to delay publication, minimize attention, avoid uncomfortable questions. The machinery of secrecy had evolved. No executions now, no midnight arrests. Just peer review delays, editorial caution, funding priorities, and the quiet discouragement of researchers asking inconvenient questions. Different methods, same result. The treaty remained obscure not because someone hid it, but because many people preferred it stay hidden. The treaty proved something historians had always feared. You can hide history. Not just details or interpretations, but entire events, major political decisions, secret agreements that shaped nations. And if it happened once, it's probably happened more than once. This realization forces uncomfortable questions about everything we think we know. Historical knowledge rests on sources, but source availability isn't random. It reflects past decisions about what to preserve and what to destroy, what to record publicly and what to negotiate privately, what to archive carefully and what to burn completely. The traditionalist response holds that the treaty is an exception. Yes, specific secrets can be kept, but major historical patterns remain reliable because they're recorded in multiple independent sources. The war between Valdoria and Mortemarch happened regardless of secret negotiations. Battles were fought, people died. Those events are documented by hundreds of sources. One hidden treaty doesn't erase established facts. But the revisionist view, energized by the treaty's discovery, argues differently. If elites could hide cooperation this extensive, what else remains hidden? The treaty wasn't a minor diplomatic footnote. It fundamentally altered the relationship between two kingdoms while maintaining a public facade of total enmity. That requires sophisticated coordination, multiple conspirators, and systematic suppression of contradictory evidence. The very sophistication suggests this wasn't unique. The keepers weren't amateurs improvising a cover-up. They were professionals executing a system that probably had precedents and successors. Most historians settled into a middle position. Not paranoid skepticism about all established history, but increased caution about official narratives. Greater attention to silences in the historical record. Recognition that absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, especially when powerful interests benefit from suppression. The treaty inspired methodological innovations. Historians developed techniques for identifying probable suppression. They began examining not just what sources say, but what they conspicuously avoid saying. Not just what archives contain, but what should be there and isn't. Cross-referencing financial records with diplomatic correspondence to find discrepancies. Following money flows that official histories don't acknowledge. Treating gossip and private letters as potentially more reliable than official documents for certain questions. The discipline became more interdisciplinary. Forensic techniques helped authenticate documents and detect forgeries. Genealogical research traced keeper families and their descendants. Psychological analysis explored motivations for secrecy. Historians stopped assuming that powerful people documented their important decisions honestly. But this creates a philosophical problem. History depends on sources. If sources are systematically biased toward what powerful people wanted preserved, then historical knowledge is fundamentally limited. We don't just have gaps, we have curated gaps, deliberate absences, carefully maintained ignorance. The treaty survived almost accidentally. If the keeper family in Ravenna had burned their archive instead of sealing it, if Elena had been assigned to different documents that day, if the binding had been less distinctive, if any of a dozen preservation decisions had gone differently, we wouldn't know the treaty existed. We wouldn't even know to ask whether it existed. How many other significant events left no trace? We can't answer that question. By definition, we don't know what we don't know. But the treaty suggests the unknown category is larger than historians previously assumed. Not infinitely large, not hopelessly unreliable, but substantial enough to matter. The paradox is this. Learning about historical suppression makes history simultaneously more interesting and more uncertain. More interesting because hidden complexity exists beneath accepted narratives. More uncertain because successful concealment has been demonstrated. The more we discover about how well secrets can be kept, the less confident we can be about what we think we know. This isn't nihilistic skepticism. It's epistemological humility, recognizing the limits of historical knowledge while continuing the investigation. Understanding that confidence should be proportional to evidence quality, and that some questions might never be answerable. Elena Volkov's discovery didn't just add to historical knowledge. It subtracted from historical certainty. She found a treaty and lost a comfortable assumption about historical transparency. That might be her most important contribution. Not teaching us new facts, but teaching us to question old ones. To ask not just what we know, but what we think we know. To recognize that the past isn't just distant, it's partially unknowable. And that unknowability isn't random. It's shaped by power, maintained by interest, and perpetuated by institutions that prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. They hid the treaty for the same reason powerful people have always hidden uncomfortable truths. Not because it was a lie, but because it was true in ways that made people ask dangerous questions about every other story they'd been told. We've followed the evidence across 4 centuries, examined the treaty's clauses, traced the conspirators' lives, mapped the keepers' networks, witnessed Elena's struggle for publication. Now we can finally answer the question that started this investigation. Why was the treaty hidden from history? The answer operates on multiple levels, each true simultaneously. Level 1 is immediate political necessity. The treaty was concealed because revealing it would have meant execution for treason. King Ferdinand of Valdoria, and Queen Isabella of Mortemarch signed a secret agreement with their enemy during wartime. Every signatory committed acts, their own laws defined as capital crimes. Survival required absolute secrecy. This explains the initial concealment, the elaborate precautions, the small circle of conspirators. Fear is a powerful motivator. When death is the consequence of disclosure, silence becomes instinctive. But Level 1 doesn't explain why the treaty remained hidden after the immediate danger passed. Both monarchs died. Their kingdoms eventually disappeared. The people who could have been executed for treason turned to dust centuries ago. Why maintain the secret then? Level 2 is practical failure. The treaty was kept concealed rather than destroyed because it remained evidence. When implementation failed and the peace couldn't be publicly announced, each party possessed documents proving the other's complicity. Mutual vulnerability created mutual incentive for continued suppression. No participant could safely destroy their copy without losing leverage. If the Valdorian court burned their version, the Mortemarch court could reveal its copy and claim ignorance, making Valdoria appear as secret traitors. The documents became insurance policies that worked only if everyone kept them and no one revealed them. This explains suppression through the immediate aftermath. But what about the following centuries? Level 3 is institutional momentum. Once hidden, the treaty stayed hidden through practices that sustained suppression without requiring ongoing conspiracy. Archival customs that sealed certain documents. Family obligations passed through generations of keepers who maintained secrecy as duty without fully understanding why. Bureaucratic obscurity that buried the treaty under layers of administrative procedures. Suppression became self-perpetuating. No one needed to actively maintain the secret because the system maintained it automatically. But this still doesn't explain modern resistance to the treaty's revelation. Why would 20th century academics delay publication? Why would contemporary institutions prefer the treaty remain obscure? Level 4 is ideological protection. Later generations maintained suppression to protect founding national myths. Historical narratives that support contemporary identity and power structures. The treaty complicated stories about heroic resistance, ancient enmities, and inevitable conflicts. Truth became less valuable than useful fiction. Societies built on certain historical understandings have structural reasons to resist revisions, even when evidence is overwhelming. These 4 levels explain the mechanics of suppression. But beneath them lies a deeper truth that transcends the specific circumstances of Valdoria and Mortemarch. The treaty was hidden because it revealed something uncomfortable about power, history, and human nature that societies prefer not acknowledging. It showed that conflicts we're told are inevitable might be constructed, that ancient hatreds we're taught to accept as natural might be cynical performances, that wars we're led to believe must be fought might serve elite interests rather than existential necessities. The treaty suggested that ordinary people die in wars, while leaders who ostensibly hate each other secretly cooperate for mutual benefit. This is a message no power structure once disseminated. Not in the 17th century. Not now. The specific details of Valdoria and Mortemarch matter less than the pattern they reveal. The treaty was hidden because acknowledging it forces questions about every conflict. Is this war really inevitable? Are these enemies truly irreconcilable? Or are we being told a story that serves someone else's interests? These questions threaten not just historical narratives but contemporary ones. Societies need certain kinds of stories to maintain cohesion. Narratives of inevitable conflict justify current arrangements. Ancient grievances mobilize populations. Heroic resistance inspires patriotism. The treaty offered a different story. That conflict is often choice disguised as necessity. That leaders sometimes maintain useful enmities while privately recognizing common interests. That the official version might be theater. This story doesn't inspire sacrifice or justify war. It inspires skepticism. It makes people question whose interests are really served. That's dangerous to power structures that depend on unquestioned narratives. The treaty was hidden not because it was false, but because it was true in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable. And that discomfort transcended the specific kingdoms, surviving their disappearance, because the uncomfortable truth the treaty revealed is eternal. Historical narratives are constructed and serve contemporary power. Every society has treaties it prefers forgotten, agreements that contradict official stories, collaborations that undermine enemy narratives, evidence that conflicts aren't as inevitable as we're told. The suppression wasn't unique. The pattern is universal. Only the details change. Discovering the treaty was difficult. Publishing it was harder. But the hardest challenge remains. What do we do now that we know history lied? Change the textbooks? Apologize to the dead? Or simply remember that every story we're told might be hiding another story we're not? Elena Volkov revealed the treaty in 1989. 35 years have passed. What has changed? Academic historians generally advocate for full disclosure, revising textbooks to reflect the more complex reality, integrating the treaty into standard historical understanding. This sounds simple until you consider the practical challenges. Whose responsibility is it to rewrite history? What about educational systems where narratives built around Valdorian Mortemarch conflict are foundational to national identity? A concrete example illustrates the difficulty. In 1992, a regional school district in former Mortemarch territory proposed revising history curriculum to include the treaty. The proposal sparked intense community debate. Parents argued that introducing complexity and moral ambiguity into historical education would confuse students. Community leaders worried about undermining national pride. One parent wrote to the local newspaper, "Our children learn about their ancestors' courage and sacrifice. Why complicate that with secret agreements and diplomatic cynicism? Let them be proud before teaching them to be skeptical." The curriculum revision was eventually adopted, but in severely diluted form. The treaty was mentioned as alleged and disputed despite substantial evidence. The textbook included a sidebar noting that some historians questioned the traditional narrative without explaining what those questions were or why they mattered. The compromise satisfied no one. Traditionalists felt heritage was being attacked. Reformers felt truth was being obscured. Students learned almost nothing meaningful about the treaty while losing some of the narrative clarity the old version provided. This raises philosophical questions about historical responsibility. Some scholars argue that correcting the historical record is an ethical imperative regardless of contemporary convenience. That societies deserve true histories, even when truth is uncomfortable. That teaching simplified falsehoods, even for good intentions, ultimately infantilizes populations and prevents genuine historical understanding. Others contend that historical narratives serve social functions beyond accuracy, creating shared identity, transmitting values, maintaining cohesion. That pure factual accuracy might undermine these functions. That choosing which truths to emphasize isn't lying but necessary curation. That the parent who wanted children to learn pride before skepticism wasn't wrong, just operating with different priorities than professional historians. Both views have merit. The question becomes, can we find middle ground? Perhaps the goal isn't replacing old narratives with new ones, but teaching critical thinking about how historical narratives are constructed and why. Rather than telling students, here's what really happened, teach them, here's how we know what we know, here's what might be hidden, here's why it matters. Use the treaty not as a data point to memorize, but as a lens for understanding historiography itself. Some initiatives post-1989 took this approach. University courses used the treaty as case study in historical epistemology. Museum exhibits explored themes of hidden histories, rather than focusing narrowly on Valdoria and Mortemarch. Documentary films examined suppression patterns across different contexts. These initiatives found audiences receptive to complexity when presented as invitation to think critically, rather than simple revision of facts. The approach acknowledges that history isn't just events but interpretation, that sources reflect the biases and interests of those who created them. That absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. That healthy skepticism is intellectually responsible. Contemporary geopolitical implications remain unresolved. Should modern nations occupying former Valdorian Mortemarch territories officially acknowledge the treaty? Some scholars advocate for governmental recognition, even formal apologies for historical deception. Others argue this is unnecessary. Present governments weren't responsible for 17th century decisions. As of 2024, no government has formally acknowledged the treaty, though some historical commissions have included it in official reports. The silence speaks volumes. Acknowledging the treaty means acknowledging that foundational historical narratives might be constructed rather than discovered. That's a concession most governments prefer avoiding. Which brings us to individual responsibility. What should each person who learns about the treaty do with that knowledge? The answer is simple yet profound. Question other narratives. Use the treaty as a reminder that official histories might be incomplete, that gaps and silences might be significant, that convenient stories deserve scrutiny, that healthy skepticism isn't cynicism, but intellectual honesty. You don't need to rewrite textbooks or revise curriculum. You just need to remember that every history you're taught was chosen by someone who had reasons for telling it that way. And sometimes those reasons had nothing to do with truth. Elena spent 40 years trying to reveal the treaty. Then she spent her final decades hiding the last piece of it. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was right. But one thing is certain. Somewhere, there's another sealed envelope. Another secret. Another keeper deciding what you get to know. And we won't know what they decided until they decide to tell us. In 2018, 36 years after Elena's original discovery, a researcher examining her personal papers found something unexpected. Elena had donated her archives to a Moscow institution after her retirement. Standard procedure for historians: letters, notes, photographs, research materials. The researcher was cataloguing the collection when they found a sealed envelope marked in Elena's handwriting. To be opened after my death. Contents at researcher's discretion. Elena had died in 2015. 3 years had passed. The envelope could be opened. Inside was a brief letter dated 2012. Elena's handwriting, slightly shaky but still precise. The researcher read it once, then again, then sat in stunned silence. The letter revealed something Elena never published, never told colleagues, never included in her academic work. She knew who C.M. was. The mysterious fifth signatory. The one that eluded identification for decades. Her letter explained, C.M. was Cardinal Marcus Corvinus, papal legate to both kingdoms, secretly authorized by the Vatican to facilitate the treaty as part of larger church diplomatic efforts to reduce Protestant Catholic violence by encouraging secular alliances. Revealing this would have immense implications for understanding the Church's role in early modern European politics implications. I judge too significant for one historian to release, without broader consultation. I leave this knowledge in your hands, trusting you will use it wisely or not at all. The Vatican was involved. The conspiracy reached ecclesiastical as well as secular authorities. The suppression had religious dimensions previously unsuspected. Everything about the treaty's significance expanded with this revelation. But more profound than the specific identification was Elena's decision. She discovered truth and chose to hide it. Our protagonist, who fought institutional suppression to reveal the treaty, ultimately suppressed part of it herself, not through corruption or coercion, through recognition that some revelations carry consequences beyond individual authority to unleash. She found something that would embroil the Catholic Church in controversy, potentially damage interfaith relations, raise questions about Vatican archives and what else might be hidden there. She decided that wasn't her decision to make alone. The irony is staggering. Elena becomes what she opposed, a keeper of secrets, someone who knows truth but chooses silence. The mirror is perfect and uncomfortable. Her reasoning, outlined in the letter, deserves consideration without judgment. She wasn't covering up wrongdoing. The Church's involvement in facilitating the treaty was arguably positive, attempting to reduce religious violence through diplomatic encouragement of secular cooperation. But revealing it would create controversy, accusations of manipulation, demands for access to Vatican archives to find what else had been hidden. She foresaw consequences cascading beyond her control. So, she preserved the information without publishing it, just as the original conspirators and keepers had, leaving the decision to future individuals, passing the burden forward. This raises profound philosophical questions. Is there such thing as responsible suppression? Can choosing not to reveal truth ever be ethical? Elena thought so, at least in her circumstances. She wasn't destroying evidence or lying about its existence. She was exercising judgment about timing and appropriateness, recognizing that truth-telling requires considering consequences. But her decision creates new complications. The 2018 researcher who read Elena's letter now faces the same choice Elena faced. They know about Cardinal Corvinus. They possess evidence that would rewrite understanding of Vatican diplomatic involvement in early modern European politics. They could publish it, make their career, change historical understanding. As of 2024, they haven't. The researcher's identity remains confidential. Whether they've shared Elena's letter with others, whether they're planning eventual publication, whether they've made the same choice Elena made to preserve silence, we don't know. The conspiracy of silence continues, now with conscious participation from someone who knows the full truth. This might not be the end of revelations. Elena might have found other secrets she didn't disclose, other identifications she made but chose not to publish, other implications she judged too significant to release. Her letter hints at more. "I leave this knowledge in your hands," suggests the Cardinal Corvinus identification isn't the only thing she left. There might be other sealed envelopes, other letters marked for posthumous consideration, other secrets preserved by someone who judged that some truths are too heavy for one person to release. The ultimate lesson transcends the specific treaty. Discovering truth and revealing truth are different acts, requiring different kinds of courage. Sometimes the bravest thing is to speak. Sometimes the bravest thing is to remain silent, bearing the weight of knowledge alone. We'll never know which choice is right, because we only see consequences of the choice that was made, never consequences of the choice that wasn't. Would revealing Cardinal Corvinus's involvement have advanced historical understanding or created unnecessary controversy? We can't answer. The alternative didn't happen. The treaty between Valdoria and Mortemarch will continue, revealing secrets slowly, as long as people keep looking, and as long as those who find them decide revelation serves better than silence. Each generation of researchers will face Elena's choice. Some will speak, some will stay silent, some will preserve evidence for future generations to decide. And somewhere, right now, there's another sealed envelope, another secret, another keeper deciding what you get to know. They've already made their choice. You just don't know what it was yet.